Hello everyone, I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The hallway was a yawning void of shadows and oppressive silence, interrupted only by the faint creaks of ancient floorboards. Beneath worn carpeting, a single weak bulb flickered overhead, casting elongated shapes on the walls that quivered like living things. From the moment I stepped into that corridor, I felt an intruder, as though I had trespassed on a secret that the building itself did not want me to uncover. My chest tightened at the very air, heavy with neglect and old dust, even before setting foot in my assigned room. The uneasy grip of the hotel's atmosphere sank hooks of dread into my mind and refused to let go. I had arrived late in the evening for a work trip, my itinerary too cramped to allow me the luxury of a modern hotel closer to the city center. The front desk clerk, with eyes that drifted to the floor more often than they met. My own handed me a tarnished brass key and mentioned in a low tone that I was free to explore the lounge should I wish. He murmured some half-hearted apology about the building's antiquated facilities. His exact words barely registered because I was too caught up studying in the peeling wallpaper, its floral pattern discolored by what looked like decades of dampness. My stomach churned with a faint sense of unease. I tried to shrug off. After all, I just needed a place to sleep. My room was up 2 flights of creaking stairs. The banister felt sticky under my palm, as though 100 hands over 100 years had left their invisible residue on the wood. A mild smell clung to the air, and the only source of illumination in the corridor was a solitary light fixture, flickering erratically as if uncertain whether to remain lit or plunge everything into darkness. My door number 305 opened with a groan that resonated in the silence. Inside the room was as old-fashioned as expected, a single bed with a carved headboard, a small nightstand with a lamp that cast a feeble glow, and heavy drapes that blocked what little moonlight might have filtered through the radiator. By the wall clicked quietly, spitting out lukewarm air. I set my suitcase down and exhaled, trying to ease the tension in my shoulders. As I turned to latch the door, I couldn't help noticing the nameplate on the neighboring room. It had been removed, leaving only 2 rusted screws protruding from the wood. I told myself it was just one more example of the hotel's age. Nothing more. My mind resisted any creeping thoughts about what might have happened to the original nameplate, or why nobody had bothered to replace it. The first sign that something was off came just before midnight. I was lying in bed, the comforter too thin to shield me from the building's pervasive chill. Despite my exhaustion, sleep evaded me. The silence in the corridor had a peculiar quality. It felt alive, stretching and contracting like a held breath. Then I heard footsteps, soft and hesitant, as though someone were pacing back and forth, unsure of where to go or what they intended to do. My heart thumped against my ribcage. I tried to convince myself that maybe another guest was simply restless, or perhaps the old structure was just groaning with the wind. Curiosity got the better of me. I slid out of bed, feeling the rough fibers of the carpet under my bare feet. Each step I took toward the door heightened my anxiety. My pulse roared in my ears as I opened it, expecting to confront someone in the corridor, but there was nothing, only the same weak overhead light quivering. The footsteps ceased. The instant I stepped out at the far end of the hallway, I could have sworn I saw a faint movement, a shifting of shadow or a silhouette that vanished as soon as my eyes tried to focus, but that might have been my imagination. The emptiness of the corridor challenged me to prove otherwise. I closed my door softly, trying not to disturb whatever intangible presence might be lurking there. The second I turned around, I heard a slam. It came from the adjacent room, the one missing its nameplate. The sound jolted through me like an electric shock. My hands went cold, and I could hear my breathing raspy and shallow, as if my lungs were suddenly starved of oxygen. I inched closer to the wall that separated my room from the neighboring one, and felt a tremor of fear vibrate in my bones under the door. A narrow strip of yellow light flickered on and off, as if someone inside was pacing with a flashlight. The floor creaked, or maybe it was the bed frame or the radiator. Then came a sound that almost froze the blood in my veins. Something akin to muffled cries, not quite screams, but certainly more than mere whispers. I pressed my ear to the wall, my skin prickling. It was a low moaning interspersed with what sounded like hurried movements, shuffling feet, a jolt of something heavy hitting the floor, and then an abrupt hush. My heart pounded so violently that I half expected it to burst through my rib cage. I had the insane urge to knock on the door to demand to know what was happening in there, but terror rooted me in place. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before deciding to go to the front desk. By the time I reached the lobby, my breathing had steadied somewhat, but my nerves still buzzed. The clerk looked up at me with an expression that seemed more worried than surprised. I struggled to find the right words, stammering something about the room next to mine and the noises I had heard. He responded in a cautious tone that the adjacent room had been vacant for months. Explaining that no one was staying there, I felt my scalp tighten as if a cold finger was sliding across it. I tried to clarify, telling him I had heard a door slam and strange sounds. He said that he checked the records, but according to everything on file, I was alone on that floor. I returned to my room more confused than ever. My sense of reality wavered, leaving me to wonder if my overworked brain had conjured the entire episode. I tried to rationalize that old buildings can produce unsettling echoes. Pipes can clang, and the mind can interpret those noises in sinister ways when one is tired. Yet none of those rationalizations fully explain the flickering light or the distinct sound of a door slamming. Night stretched on relentlessly, and I drifted in and out of restless sleep. At times, I was convinced I heard someone knocking. Softly on the walls, my body broke out in a clammy sweat, and my eyes snapped open in the darkness, scouring the room for any movement. Each time I checked the corridor, the flickering overhead light seemed a little dimmer, and the far end of the hallway appeared more shrouded in shadow. At one point, I thought I saw the handle of the neighboring door jiggle, but I couldn't be certain if it was just a trick of the light. Fear settled in my gut like lead tangling with my intestines. The next morning, daylight brought a fragile sense of safety, though the gloom of the corridor never really relented. I ate a quick breakfast in the hotel lounge. The place was virtually empty, and the same clerk from the previous night was absent instead. Another staff member, older and seemingly more at ease, offered me a brief nod. I considered mentioning what I had heard, but I felt self-conscious. Perhaps it was better not to speak about it at all. My day was supposed to be filled with meetings, so I pushed the memory aside, hoping that a busy schedule would banish the hotel's lingering negativity from my mind at work. However, I found it impossible to concentrate my mind. Replayed those night sounds repeatedly. My coworkers must have noticed my distracted state, but I pretended to focus on the tasks at hand. During a break, I found myself studying my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I looked pale and drawn with dark circles under my eyes that made me look older. A wave of restlessness prickled beneath my skin as if I could not escape the uneasy presence of that corridor, not even in broad daylight miles away from the hotel. By the time I returned in the late afternoon, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon, and the building's old windows reflected a cyan-orange light that gave the structure a haunted quality. That evening, I tried to make sense of the situation by exploring the hallway more thoroughly. I paced from one end to the other, observing how the floor sagged in places and how the wallpaper buckled and curled at the corners. A few doors down, I noticed a small alcove with a dusty mirror and a table that looked centuries old as my gaze passed over the reflective surface. I swore I glimpsed a shape behind me, tall and indistinct, but when I spun around, there was only emptiness. The pounding in my chest felt almost unbearable at that point, and goosebumps crawled along my arms. The unsettling feeling of being watched was suffocating. I rushed back to my room with my pulse hammering in my temples later. As I lay there in the oppressive silence, I braced myself for another round of unexplained sounds. Sure enough, at around midnight, the footsteps began again. They were more insistent this time, like someone pacing in agitation. My palms went clammy and my breath caught in my throat. Then came the door slam louder than before. I shot upright in bed. Heart lurching, a quick glance at my phone told me it was just past midnight. My mouth had gone dry and every hair on my body stood on end. Determined not to cower in bed, I inched toward the door with every nerve on high alert. The corridor light was even dimmer now, as if the electricity itself were being siphoned. Away by some unseen force, my heart drummed so loudly that it was a miracle I could hear anything else. Yet I did hear it muted shuffling just behind the door of the vacant room. It sounded like a struggle or a frantic search. My instinct screamed at me to get away, but curiosity urged me to step closer. The handle of the door next to mine rattled, and then I witnessed something that made my stomach turn to ice. The door slowly inched open, though no one stood there to push it. I caught a glimpse of the interior bathed in a flickering, sickly light. The shapes inside were vague broken furniture, torn curtains, a long corridor of shadows that shouldn't logically exist given the room size. My heart thundered, and a sensation like invisible hands clutching my chest robbed me of breath. Then just as quietly, the door shut itself with a snap that reverberated through the hallway in a rush of panic. I bolted to the stairs. My legs felt numb, barely able to support me as I stumbled down the desk clerk. The same subdued figure as my first night listened to my incoherent account with the blankest expression. I could sense that he was uneasy. Though he tried to maintain composure, he stated again that the room in question had not been rented for a significant period of time, and that if I was disturbed by noises, he could move me to a different floor. I sensed he was accustomed to hearing strange reports. I almost accepted his offer, but an odd determination flared. Within me, I felt a need to confront whatever was in that room, or else I'd remain forever haunted by the possibilities, so I declined his suggestion and thanked him. Feigning confidence I did not feel back in my own room, I resolutely locked the door and pressed my back against it. My mind swirling with worst-case scenarios, part of me questioned my sanity. Had stress and lack of sleep driven me to imagine it all? Could old Pipe's cunning, reflections, and the building's general disrepair here have conspired to trick me? But no, the memory of that door opening on its own would not be so easily dismissed. The raw terror I felt was too visceral to be a mere figment of imagination. I decided to perform a small test. I wedged a chair under my doorknob to ensure no one or no thing could enter. Then I turned off the lights and pressed my ear to the shared wall. What I heard was faint but undeniable, whispering a laugh language or an intonation I couldn't decipher. My heart pounded so hard my chest actually ached. There came a low scraping noise, as though furniture were being dragged across the floor in that other room. With each scrape, my entire body tensed. A single bead of sweat trickled down my forehead, and my breath came in ragged pulls. The terror built to a crescendo inside me, a suffocating tide of dread. I felt as though the corridor walls were closing in, as if the entire hotel was breathing around me, filling its corridors with a malevolent presence. My nails dug into my palms, leaving crescents of pain that grounded me just enough to form a plan I would leave at first light. If the thing next door was determined to remain hidden, it could keep its domain, and I would not be the one to unravel whatever secrets haunted that space. But the night stretched on, refusing to end swiftly. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to find myself lying on the floor with my back to the wall. A watery gray light filtered through the heavy drapes, suggesting dawn was on the horizon. My limbs were stiff and my neck ached, yet a curious sense of calm washed over me as I realized I had survived another round of those unsettling events without even changing out of my wrinkled clothes. I packed my suitcase, fumbling with the zipper because my fingers shook so badly my mind was set. I needed to escape the suffocating gloom of that hotel before it consumed my sanity. Entirely descending the stairs, I felt a heaviness behind me, as though eyes were tracing my every step. But I resisted the urge to look back upon reaching the lobby. I found the desk empty except for a handwritten note propped up against a tarnished bell. It merely read that I could leave my key on the counter. Every fiber of my being wanted to run out the front door and never look back yet. A sliver of morbid curiosity made me glance once over my shoulder. There at the top of the stairs, I thought I glimpsed a faint shape, human-like, tall, indistinct, and observing me with a stillness that spoke of unspeakable secrets. My chest tightened as a wave of apprehension rolled over me. I forced my gaze away and stepped through the exit. A cold early morning breeze hit my face, reviving my senses with its sharp bite driving away. I couldn't shake the sensation that the entire place was some kind of living entity, that the vac room was a wound in its side, festering with something ancient and malevolent. Though I never gleaned its full nature or purpose, I have no desire to return and satisfy that curiosity. Even now, back in the comfort of my own home, I sometimes wake in the dead of night, convinced I hear hesitant footsteps pacing just outside my bedroom door. The memory forces my heart to hammer in my chest until I remind myself that I'm safe, far from that place. Still, the impression lingers that whatever called to me from behind the vacant room's door wasn't finished, and it may only be a matter of time before it finds a way to stretch its influence. Beyond those crumbling walls, it's a disquieting thought that has burrowed into my subconscious, ensuring that some night's sleep comes only after a final desperate reassurance that my doors are locked, my windows secured, and that the darkness beyond them is just emptiness, not a silent corridor of an ancient hotel waiting to reveal horrors best left unseen. I felt it the moment I stepped out of the elevator, an oppressive, almost tangible sense of isolation pressing in from every corner of the hallway. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a weak white glow over the silent corridor. It was already after 10 at night, and I had stayed behind to finish a crucial report my boss needed for the next morning. I'd worked late before, but something about the stillness of that particular evening felt ominous. From the start, I headed straight to my office, trying to ignore how each of my steps reverberated unnaturally along the walls. Usually, the hum of people talking on phones or walking to the break room offered some comfort, even late in the day, but that night, nearly everyone had gone home by 8, and I was the only person left on the entire floor. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. Inside my office, I flipped on the overhead light and tossed my jacket on the back of the chair. The stale air felt heavier than usual, almost as though the ventilation system had shut down. My shirt clung to my skin, and a thin film of sweat already formed at my hairline. With a sigh, I dropped into the seat in front of my computer, determined to push aside the uneasy feeling and get my work done. Minutes stretched on in silence, broken only by the soft clicking of my keyboard and the ticking of a wall clock that sounded unnaturally loud in the void. I tried to focus on the spreadsheet, but my thoughts wandered. Every so often I found myself glancing at the open door, convinced I'd heard a rustle or a creak in the hallway. Each time I saw nothing but a strip of fluorescent light falling across the vacant corridor. My heart pounded a little harder every time I looked. It was as if my body was bracing for a sudden appearance, someone or something stepping into view. But each time I checked, I was alone. After about an hour of this strained concentration, I decided a cup of coffee might help settle my nerves. I told myself that caffeine would ground me, keep my mind alert, and maybe chase away the growing anxiety constricting my chest. I stood up, trying not to focus on how the silence made even the rustle of my pant legs seem unnaturally loud. My pulse felt heavier than usual, and I realized I was short of breath, as though I'd been running. Reaching the hallway, I was struck by a weird echo of my footsteps. The corridor stretched out with pale fluorescent lights reflecting off the highly polished floor, giving everything a sickly sheen. As I approached the large glass window near the break room, I caught my own distorted reflection, but then I noticed a second figure, some shape behind me, standing still as if it were staring straight into my back alarm. Shot through me in an instant, sending cold shockwaves to my fingertips. My breath caught in my throat and my heartbeat hammered violently in my ears. I whirled around, nearly stumbling, but the space behind me was empty. Just the same stretch of hallway I had walked down. For a moment, I remained rooted to the spot, chest rising and falling in quick, shallow gasps. The corridor was unoccupied, the overhead lights illuminated plain walls. Without any shadows that might explain what I had seen, my scalp prickled and the sweat at my temples felt cold, as if the building's air conditioning had suddenly blasted on. But I heard no whir from the vents, telling myself that maybe my eyes had played a trick in the reflection. I forced my legs to move toward the break room. The sensation that something or someone was observing me didn't fade. My every step felt like a performance for an audience hidden just out of sight. The coffee machine was the only source of noise when I arrived. The mechanical hiss and gurgle as it brewed a fresh cup, I focused on that sound, trying to pretend I was just another late-night worker in an ordinary office scenario, but the hairs on the back of my neck refused to lie flat. My mouth felt parched tongue sticking to the roof, so I gulped water from the faucet while the coffee finished. When the machine beeped, I took the hot cup and made my way back to my office. I tried to calm myself by mentally recapping deadlines and tasks for the rest of the week. It didn't help. Every so often a sudden hush descended, an emptiness that settled over the place like a shroud. A single repeated thought kept coming to mind. I was not alone, no matter how much I told myself otherwise. Back at my desk, I resumed my work. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed, and my concentration was broken by the slightest shift in lighting. Several times I stared at the door. The longer I sat there, the more convinced I became that something lurked in the hallway waiting for me to move. I tried to dismiss it as nerves and overactive imagination fueled by too many horror movies and too little sleep. But deep down there was a primal sense of dread I couldn't shake. Eventually I decided that maybe some music might keep my mind from wandering. I put on my headphones, found a familiar instrumental playlist, and turned the volume low enough so that I could still pick up on any external noise. The gentle melody did help. At first I lost myself in the monotony of data entry. My heart rate slowed and the tightness in my chest began to ease. Then the lights in my office flickered, just a momentary blink like a tired eyelid, but it was enough to make me rip off the headphones. My gaze jumped to the fluorescent tubes overhead, watching as they settled back into a steady hum. I remained frozen for a good 30 seconds. Listening, the building responded with a kind of low mechanical groan, a sound that drifted through the ventilation ducts like a distant moan. I realized I was gripping the edge of my desk with white, knuckled intensity, letting out a shaky breath. I tried to laugh off the flicker as a normal electrical glitch, but as if on cue, the lights pulsed again, sending a brief strobe effect through the room. In those fractions of a second, I thought I saw movement in the corridor, a silhouette passing by the door. My heart dead in my chest and my entire body tensed. Without conscious thought, I got up and crept toward the doorway. My breath was shallow and quick, each inhale feeling like a gulp of stale air. I peered out into the corridor, half expecting to see a shape lurking by the wall. There was nothing. The quiet felt denser than ever, pressing in on me. Filling my ears with an uncomfortable ring, I returned to my desk, forcing myself to keep working. My mind churned with possible explanations. Maybe it was the security guard from downstairs doing a round. But the security guard usually announced himself with a friendly knock or at least the jingle of keys. Then I wondered if a colleague had stayed late without telling me, though that seemed unlikely. Time crawled by and my report was nearly finished. The combination of tension and the chill from the air conditioning. If it was even on left me shivering intermittently, the coffee, now lukewarm, hadn't done much good. My palms were sweaty, leaving faint smudges on my mouse. I felt sure I heard muffled steps outside the office, but every time I stopped typing to listen, the noise vanished. Eventually, I decided to do a final walk around the floor, half hoping I'd find someone else, half terrified that I would. I left my office light on and ventured down the corridor. The echo of my shoes reverberated against stark white walls. I glanced at the reflective glass as I passed, unable to resist checking it for that figure again. I saw only my reflection, pale, dark-circled eyes, a tired expression. I exhaled in relief. Then I noticed something else behind me in the reflection. One of the doors down the hall looked slightly ajar when I turned to face it. Though the door was completely closed, a chill crawled up my spine. The kind of sensation that makes every hair on your body stand on end. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I walked over to that door just to confirm it was locked, or at least shut. Indeed, it was sealed tight. The placard on it indicated an unused storage room, one I'd never really bothered to explore. I put a hand on the knob. It felt cool almost unnaturally. So against my warm, clammy palm, I tried to turn it, expecting to find it locked, but it gave way with a loud click. Darkness greeted me on the other side. My chest constricted as a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I fumbled for a light switch, eventually flipping on a single bulb that buzzed to life. illuminating rows of metal shelves packed with old office supplies. The air inside was stagnant, smelling faintly of dust and cardboard. At a glance, it appeared deserted, just a neglected storeroom, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that moments before I had caught a glimpse of something else standing in that doorway. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might throw up. I stepped into the room, telling myself I needed to confirm nothing was there. The single light cast harsh shadows against the shelving. My eyes darted from one angle to the next. The hum of the bulb was loud, a continuous droning that set my teeth on edge. I felt a sudden wave of nausea, as though the entire space were pressing in on me. The corners of my vision seemed to shimmer. My mind raced with the question, was I losing it? After a few moments of tense silence, I backed out of the room, flicked the light off, and shut the door. I made sure it locked this time. Tugging the handle to confirm it was secure, my hand trembled with each pull, feeling an odd sense of dread. I forced myself away and headed back to my office, determined to gather my things and leave. I couldn't justify staying there any longer. Not with my nerves fraying at the edges. As I made my way down the corridor again, I heard a sudden scrape on the floor, a faint dragging sound that made my blood run cold. I stopped in my tracks. The sound ceased. My body was in flight or fight mode. My lungs burned with each breath, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might punch a hole through my chest. I pushed forward, every sense on high alert. The overhead lights continued their intermittent flickers, so each step felt like walking through snapshots of reality. At times, the corridor seemed to stretch as if the building itself were warping. I fought the urge to break into a run, knowing that if I started running, I might not be able to stop. I just wanted to reach my office, grab my briefcase, and get out. When I got there, something was off. The door was ajar, even though I remembered leaving it open wide. My stomach knotted as I peered inside. The overhead fluorescent lights were off, and the only illumination came from the computer monitor. The screen displayed my unfinished spreadsheet, but the rows and columns were glitching. Flashing random numbers, my chair sat at an angle as if it had been spun around. I stood at the doorway, paralyzed by indecision. Then I heard a faint whisper like a distant breeze passing through a crack. It could have been the ventilation, except it carried the unmistakable cadence of a voice. The blood drained from my face, and I felt rivulets of sweat roll down my temples. My eyes darted around the dim office, searching for an explanation. My breathing was loud in my own ears, ragged and shallow. For a moment, I questioned whether I was physically safe. Was it a stranger who had wandered in, or something I couldn't understand? A primal instinct roared in my mind, telling me to get away from that office, but my bag and keys were inside, and I refused to leave them behind. Summoning courage from the pit of my stomach, I stepped into the darkness, heart drumming like a warning. My hand groped along the wall until I found the light switch. I pressed it, and the fluorescent lamp above clicked and flickered to life. The room looked as it always did, except for my computer screen, which still glitched with random symbols. Then in the reflection of the monitor, I saw the silhouette again, standing directly behind me. The color drained from my vision. My lungs seized. I whipped around, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. Nothing was there. I backed up against my desk, knocking some papers to the floor. The tension in my muscles was so severe I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. With trembling hands, I forced myself to shut down the computer, grabbed my bag, and stumbled into the hallway. The corridor lights flickered in that same erratic pulse, as though they were timed to the pounding of my heart. I made a beeline for the elevator, not daring to look into the reflective windows or the dark corners of the hallway. At the elevator doors, I slammed the call button repeatedly. The wait felt interminable. Each second stretched on as I struggled to keep my composure. I thought I heard footsteps behind me again, but I refused to turn around. Every instinct telling me that if I looked, I'd see something I didn't want to see. When the elevator finally arrived with a sterile ding, I nearly leapt inside and jabbed the button for the lobby. The door slid shut, sealing me in a small fluorescent-lit box that felt almost as claustrophobic as the corridor. The overhead light was harsh. making the sweat on my face glisten. I stared at the digital floor numbers descending, counting them down in my head like a survival mantra. On the 5th floor, the elevator abruptly lurched as though it might stall. My breath caught in my throat, panic swarming in my mind. I prayed it wouldn't trap me between floors. A chill ran through my body as the elevator groaned and resumed its descent. I exhaled shakily by the time the doors opened onto the lobby. My legs felt weak and my shirt was damp with sweat. The security desk at the ENT entrance was empty, though usually someone was there. 24/7, my boss had earlier sent a text about the guard stepping away for a short break, so I rationalized it was normal, yet the emptiness echoed with menace. I crossed the lobby as quickly as I could without breaking into a sprint. The automatic doors slid open to a mercifully quiet street, bathed in the low glow of street lamps. Outside, the cold night air slapped me in the face and I gulped it down. Trying to calm the tremors in my body, I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys. My hands shook uncontrollably and each breath burned my throat. Once inside, I locked the doors immediately. My shoulders sagged in relief, but my pulse refused to slow. I stared at the looming shape of the office building in the rearview mirror. It stood tall and dark, with only a few lights on each floor indicating some lingering electrical presence. For a split second, I thought I saw a silhouette in one of the windows perhaps on my floor, watching me with unwavering intensity. A sick dread churned in my stomach and I tore my gaze away. Starting the engine as I drove home, my mind churned with questions and fears, replaying every flicker of movement, every suspicious sound. Was it all just exhaustion and an overactive imagination, or did I truly see something my rational mind fought to categorize it as a product of stress? But the primal terror that had overtaken me refused to yield. All I knew was that the building, once mundane, now felt haunted by an oppressive force that defied logic. Arriving at my apartment, I parked, got out and forced myself not to look over my shoulder, fighting the creeping paranoia that something had followed me. My skin prickled with the lingering sensation of being watched inside. I double-checked the locks on every door and turned on every light. A cold sweat dripped down the back of my neck as I tried to steady. My ragged breathing, I could still feel the adrenaline pulsing through my veins, my muscles twitching with residual panic. I tried to distract myself by flipping on the TV, but the chatter from the screen only reminded me of how alone I felt. My reflection stared back at me from the dark window behind the couch, and for a split second I imagined seeing that silhouette again, hovering close. My chest tightened until I forced myself to blink, reminding myself I was safely at home, yet no matter how much I reasoned that it was all in my head, the fear lingered, an aftertaste of dread that refused to go away. Even as I settled into bed hours later, every creak of the apartment building set my pulse racing. I kept the light on in the hallway, unable to face complete darkness that night. Sleep came only in fits, broken by nightmares of silent corridors and reflexions that moved independently. Since then, I've questioned my own sanity more than once. I've tried to reassure myself that the late hour, the flickering lights, and the silent hallways concocted the perfect brew of psychological terror, but whenever the memory surfaces, my heartbeat quickens and a cold, nauseating wave of fear grips me. Part of me knows there was something in that office building that night, some presence I can't identify or rationalize away, and even though I escape the memory of it, clings to me, whispering in the back of my mind that the boundary between what's real and what's imagined isn't nearly as solid as I once believed. I still work at the same company, though I've made it a point never to stay past 7 whenever I find myself near that reflective window after dusk. I can't help but avert my eyes, terrified of what I might see behind me, and some nights when I'm alone at my desk, I swear I feel a prickling gaze boring into the back of my neck. A voice in my mind begs me to turn around, but I refuse, gripped by the certainty that if I look, that figure will be waiting silent and motionless, just as it was in the reflection, daring me to confront a terror that defies any explanation I can bear to live with. I arrived at the old cabin just before dusk on a Monday, and the sky was already painted in eerie shades of purple and gray. The wind howled through the towering pines surrounding the property, creating an unsettling chorus that never seemed to stop. Even stepping out of my car felt strangely oppressive, as though the night itself watched me. Something about that expanse of silent trees and the single flickering porch light made me question my decision to seek solitude. In such a remote place, I remember pausing for a moment, heart thudding, wondering if a quiet mountain retreat might prove too quiet for my own good. I came to the mountain seeking peace. Work had been suffocating, and I craved an escape. I planned to spend 2 weeks in complete seclusion with no distractions other than a notebook, my laptop, and a few books for inspiration. In my mind, this rustic cabin would be the perfect place to refocus and let creativity flow. The owner had told me in a rushed phone call that the property was old but structurally sound, and that the surrounding land stretched for acres. I recall him sounding almost relieved that I wanted to stay there, as if the place had been vacant for too long. He recommended I arrive before nightfall because the narrow dirt roads became treacherous in the dark, but I almost wanted that sense of danger I'd lost my creative spark months ago, and I hoped that a brush with the unknown might reignite it. The interior of the cabin was modest: bare wooden floors, faded wallpaper, a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with a stone fireplace. The furniture looked worn, each piece sagging from age or neglect. Despite the musty smell, I could appreciate the old-world charm. I found a small desk in the corner of the living area, perfectly placed near a window that overlooked a stretch of pine trees. It felt right, a quiet place to set up my things and let ideas spill onto the page. If only the atmosphere had remained tranquil on the first night. Everything seemed normal, at least by the standards of an old wooden house in the woods. The floorboards creaked whenever I shifted my weight. A draft slipped through hidden cracks, causing the curtains to flutter. Just enough to catch my attention, I lit a small fire in the fireplace to fight the mountain chill, and its light danced across the walls in a comforting, hypnotic pattern. There was no hum of traffic outside, no lights from neighbors' windows, just the rustling of leaves and branches in the wind. The second day was calm. I walked around the property, marveling at the tall pines that formed a fortress around the cabin. I spotted a small clearing about 100 yards from the porch, where the ground sloped into a bed of rocks and moss. Some of the pine trees stood so close together their branches tangled overhead, effectively blocking out the sunlight. It gave me a sensation akin to stepping into another world, one where daylight light never fully penetrated. Although I felt a slight chill, I convinced myself it was just the cold mountain air. During the afternoon, I wrote a few pages in my notebook, feeling proud of my productivity. The cabin for a brief moment seemed like an ideal writer's haven, but that sense of peace vanished. On the third night, I had fallen asleep on the couch, lulled by the crackle of the dwindling fire. The clock on the mantel showed 3:14 a.m. When I abruptly snapped awake, my pulse hammered in my ears. Though I couldn't remember dreaming for a moment, I couldn't place what had disturbed me. Then in the silence, I heard a faint murmur, barely audible, coming from outside. It sounded like someone whispering, but the words were unintelligible. My breath caught in my throat. With every beat of my heart, the whisper seemed to inch closer, as if it was right by the window. My skin prickled with sweat, and my fingers trembled when I groped for the flashlight on the coffee table. I forced myself to the window, not daring to turn on any lights inside for fear of making myself visible. When I slowly angled the flashlight toward the porch, the beam revealed only the wooden boards, a battered rocking chair, and shadows dancing in the corner. The murmur stopped. The only sound was the wind cutting through the pines. After several minutes, I convinced myself it had been a trick of my restless mind. Yet my hands didn't stop shaking for a long time, and it took over an hour before I could lie down again. My ears attuned to every creak in the house the next day, I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps wine through the branches, or some small animal brushing against the windowsill, determined to stay rational. I spent the morning pacing the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the ground for any clues. Nothing looked disturbed. The porch was dusty, but I saw no foot there. My heart did a small leap of relief. If someone had actually approached the house, they must have left traces concluding that it was my own anxiety. I returned to my writing, though the words came slower. Now my focus was overshadowed by the memory of that disembodied murmur in the night. But by the fourth night the whispering returned. I was in bed this time. Jolted awake around the same hour by the same low-urgent sound, it was distinct enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. My heartbeat crashed into my chest as I realized it seemed closer than the night before, perhaps coming from the alpendre near the front door, grabbing my flashlight and the small can of it. I kept in my bag. I crept out of the bedroom. A cold sweat trickled down the sides of my face. The boards under my feet groaned, and each sound felt amplified by the silent tension enveloping the cabin. Reaching the front door, I paused, hardly believing I was even considering opening it, but paranoia overcame caution and I flung it open. Shining the flashlight wildly around the porch, the chairs were swaying, squeaking as the wind nudged them. No footprints in the dust, at least none that were clear. The night air felt colder than it should have, and my breath came in ragged puffs. Even with the light, the darkness beyond the porch seemed impenetrable, as though something awaited just out of sight. The whispering was gone, replaced by the usual wind. I tried to stay out there a few minutes, straining my ears to catch any further hint of that voice, but the silence was absolute. It left me feeling exposed, like I was under a microscope. I slammed the door and locked it, though that brought little comfort. Sleep was impossible after such an encounter, so I sat at the kitchen table, feeling the tightness in my chest refuse to let go. Morning light did little to lift my spirits. The realization that this was now a pattern, that some presence was whispering outside my cabin, made it impossible for me to shrug it off as a one-time hallucination. I scrutinized every inch of the yard with a kind of desperate vigilance. It was then I found footprints in a soft patch of earth near the pines. They were not well-defined more. Like partial impressions possibly made by bare feet, but I couldn't be certain. They led around the corner of the cabin, then vanished into the brush. My stomach flipped at the sight. I told myself they could be old prints, maybe left by hunters or hikers who had once passed through. Yet the dread in my veins told me otherwise. For the remainder of that day, I couldn't concentrate. Every rustle of leaves, every scrape of branches against the roof, every subtle thump inside the walls became magnified in my mind. My chest felt tight. My breathing came shallow and quick. I paced back and forth, gripping my canave as though bracing for an intruder. The vast emptiness outside wasn't calming anymore. It was suffocating. I felt as though unseen eyes lurked behind every tree trunk. The mounting anxiety distorted my sense of time. 2 afternoons stretched into evening, and I found myself drinking cup after cup of coffee, trying to stay vigilant and sharp my senses. By the 5th night, my mental state was so frayed that even the faintest noise made me jump. I stayed by the window, hand trembling against the flashlight, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. The sawing wind among the pines turned into an unholy chant in my ears. I kept imagining shapes slithering through the shadows. My heart thudded so violently it felt like it might bruise my ribs at around 3 a.m. I had taken to checking the clock obsessively. The whispers began this time. They seemed to come from multiple directions, moving around the cabin walls with an unnatural fluidity. I felt dizzy with terror. My fingers went numb around the flashlight as I pressed my ear to the window, trying to make sense of the words. They had no clear meaning. Just a collection of half-formed syllables that sounded both frantic and oddly melodic. There was a moment, no longer than a few seconds, when I froze and was convinced something peered at me through the window. My eyes latched onto a faint shape I could just barely make out beyond the glass. My breath caught in my throat. The silhouette was gone. Almost as soon as I registered it slipping out of sight with a quiet that felt deeply wrong, my skin felt clammy and a wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, frantically shining it outside, but all I saw were swaying branches I barely slept after. That I sat in an armchair canapé, resting on the cushion next to my thigh, every muscle in my body tensed for a threat I couldn't fully identify if the sun hadn't risen. I might have lost my grip on reality altogether when dawn finally broke. I felt a surge of relief so profound I almost cried the idea of spending another night in that cabin with something stalking around the perimeter. Whispering incomprehensible words became unthinkable. That morning I made the decision to leave early. The original plan was to stay 2 full weeks, but my nerves were too shaken. I couldn't focus on work, and any creative spark I might have gained was drowned out by raw terror. Packing my belongings was a hurried affair. I stuffed clothes and notebooks into my suitcase without care. My heart thrummed steadily, adrenaline surging with the sense of an impending deadline. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure that if I looked away too long I would see a face pressed against the window or a silhouette flitting across the porch as I loaded the car. I cast one final look at the property. The pines swayed ominously, their tops scraping the sky like claws. The cabin stood quiet and unassuming, bathed in daylight, looking nothing like the menacing place it had been at night. My heart pounded with a mix of relief and dread. In some twisted way, I had the fleeting impression that the cabin knew I was leaving, that whatever resided there was sorry to see me go. The mere thought sent a shiver down my spine. My hands were cold as ice, and beads of sweat dotted my forehead. Despite the crisp morning air driving away, I tried to rationalize the events. Could it have been the wind combined with an overactive imagination? Was my mind playing tricks on me due to isolation and lack of sleep? A part of me desperately wanted to believe that. But the memory of those footprints, that silhouette, and those maddening whispers clung to me. The sensation that I was being watched didn't abate until I was miles down the winding road, passing a sign that marked the edge of the property. Even then, I half expected to glimpse movement in my rearview mirror, the owner later asked in an email if everything had been okay. Stating that I had left earlier than expected, I responded in the vaguest terms, mentioning only that I had personal matters to attend to, but thanked him for the cabin rental. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I had heard or felt. Part of me knew he wouldn't understand. Or worse, maybe he would understand all too well. And I didn't want confirmation of something I was struggling to label as a product of my own. Fear weeks have passed since I returned to my apartment. My nights, even now, are filled with anxious tossing and turning. Occasionally, I jerk awake in the early hours of the morning, heart pounding in my ears, convinced that the same hushed murmurs float just beyond my window. My mind races back to that cabin, to the hush of the pines, to the footprints in the soil. I keep my Canavate on the nightstand, a foolish precaution in a city apartment, but it's the only thing that grants me a small sense of control. I've replayed those nights over and over, dissecting each detail, trying to find a logical thread that might explain it all. I continually come up short. The only conclusion I've drawn is that sometimes we invite ourselves into places that reject our presence, places that hold echoes of stories older and darker than any we could conjure. My rational side still attempts to dismiss it as the wind, the isolation, the psychological effects of being alone in an unfamiliar place. But late at night, when my mind drifts to that half-lit porch and the impossible silent chanting just outside the walls, I remember how real it felt, how I could practically feel the breath of that whisper against the glass, and I can't rid myself of the notion that those woods in that cabin are not as empty as they appear. Something followed me in the darkness, circled around the property, whispered at the threshold of my door. Even now, I sometimes press my ear against my own apartment window, listening for the faintest sign of that voice. I tell myself I'm safe, that whatever clung to that mountainside is tied to that specific ground, that it can't reach me here. Yet there's a drawing, dread and ever-present echo in my mind that won't be silenced. I suspect that if anyone else ever sets foot in that old cabin, they too will hear those night murmur weaving in and out of the pine branches. They might brush it off as a trick of the wind at first, as I did until the inevitability of the situation sinks in. No matter how far I try to distance myself, I'm haunted by the knowledge that certain places carry their own sort of life. A life that can brush against yours in profound, unsettling ways. I managed to leave before anything worse could happen, but I wonder if part of me remained behind, trapped in those endless whispering nights. Sometimes it feels as though I'm still in that musty living room, flashlight in one hand, cannafette in the other, holding my breath and waiting for the next murmur to drift through the darkness, and that is a feeling that may never truly go away. In darkness swallowed my new home from the moment I first stepped inside. The thick, stagnant air seemed almost alive, settling heavily on my shoulders as I flicked the light switch in the foyer. A single bulb sputtered to life overhead, casting a weak, quivering glow across walls stained with years of neglect. Right away, a prickle crawled up my spine as if someone hovered just beyond my field of vision, yet this old house was the best I could afford, so I told myself that I was just being paranoid. I remember letting out a long breath as I locked the door behind me, uncertain whether I felt secure or as though I just sealed myself in with something unnamed and waiting. I moved here primarily for the low cost and for its convenient proximity to the city center. The house, a once stately Victorian with a tall, sagging roof and peeling paint, sat on a quiet street, within walking distance of shops, restaurants, and my workplace on paper. It was ideal, cheap, accessible, large enough for me to have an office on the ground floor, but the instant I walked in, I sensed that the interior was wounded by time and secrets. The floorboards in the hallway creaked under my weight, releasing puffs of dust as though exhaling the memories of previous tenants. Despite my unease, I forced myself to consider practicalities. Minimal commute, more space, and a price so low it almost felt like theft. Unpacking my few belongings kept me distracted during the first 2 days. I was determined to make this place feel like home, so I scrubbed the surfaces, removed battered curtains that are of mothballs, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. Each room had its own peculiar odor, an earthy mix of mildew and stale perfume that no amount of cleaning seemed to erase. The house responded to my presence with deep groans at night, as if the wood and stone were shifting in protest. I tried not to dwell on those noises, rationalizing them as normal in any old structure. Then came the third night. I had fallen asleep around 10 o'clock, exhausted from rearranging furniture and dealing with a leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom. Sometime after midnight, I was ripped from a dreamless slumber by the sound of a door slamming shut. Downstairs, my heart fluttered in my chest, jarring me awake so abruptly that my head spun. It wasn't a subtle noise. It resonated through the entire house, echoing up the staircase and rattling the frames on the walls. I thought perhaps I'd left a window open somewhere and a gust of wind had caught it. A door, that's what I told myself as I got out of bed, ignoring the cold sweat that dotted my forehead as I slipped into my slippers. The silence thickened. There was no sign of wind, no whisper of an open window. The house was as still as a tomb. My mouth went dry and I had to force down a lump in my throat. Carefully, I opened my bedroom door, pausing when I noticed the hallways. Darkness seemed even denser than before. Every hair on my arm stood on end. The old boards groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing like a lament. Reaching the top of the stairs, I flicked the switch on the wall and a single overhead bulb cast a sickly glow, revealing the narrow staircase leading down the wood. Looked damp, the steps worn, smooth by decades of foot traffic. Descending slowly, I heard no further noises, but the tension in the air made it hard to breathe. The living room to my left stood still and gray in the gloom. I glanced toward the front door, still locked. The small window by the entry did not reveal any movement outside. I took a shaky breath, walking through the dining area and the kitchen at the back. Every door, including the one leading to the backyard, was locked from the inside with no sign of forced ENT entry. My heart pounded harder. Logic told me there was no one else inside. Yet I felt a presence so tangible I nearly stumbled. A quick look at my watch showed it was just after 2 in the morning. I decided to head back upstairs forcibly, calming my thoughts by telling myself I'd been dreaming, or maybe a window had slammed shut and latched itself. But as I returned to the base of the stairs, I froze. The door to my room where I had just come from stood firmly shut. I knew I had left it open. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached for the banister. That door had been ajar. I was certain the hair on the back of my neck stood stiff, and I felt a trickle of sweat roll down my temple, moving quietly. I crept up each step with each footfall. The sense of being watched intensified. My fingers trembled as I touched the doorknob to my room. The metal felt strangely warm, as though someone had just grasped it from the other side. I attempted to steady my breathing as I stood there. The knob jerked subtly in my hand, twisting under my palm, no push accompanied. The twist, just that terrifying rotation, as if invisible fingers were testing it. My throat went tight, and for a few seconds I couldn't do anything but watch the metal spin in place, moving as though guided by an unseen hand. I whispered to myself that I had to stay calm, that maybe the old mechanics of the door were sticking. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I felt my chest constricting, my lungs desperate for a proper breath. My heart hammered so forcefully that each beat felt like a strike against my ribs. Finally, I mustered the nerve to push the door open. The room beyond was empty, illuminated by a single lamp I had left on the window was shut. The curtain still, and not a single shadow flickered. Shaking, I closed the door behind me, turning the lock before pressing my back against the wood. I listened intently for several minutes, hearing only the unsteady rhythm of my own breathing. Then gradually exhaustion and a creeping sense of normalcy lulled me into an uneasy sleep the next morning. The events of the night seemed hazy, like a nightmare that lingered at the edge of consciousness. I went about my day intentionally avoiding the darkest corners of the house. My routine was ordinary. I brewed coffee, checked work emails, and showered in the daylight. Everything looked merely old and in need of renovation, not necessarily haunted or dangerous, yet a persistent anxiety gwed at me, making even mundane tasks feel loaded with dread. I told a coworker over the phone that I was adapting to the house's quirks. I said it with a laugh that sounded forced, hoping the conversation would convince me to believe my own words. That evening, I tried to find some records about the house's history at the local library. My research turned up vague hints of prior owners selling it quickly, never staying more than a few months. One source implied the building had been used as a boarding house decades ago, but no official documentation confirmed that. A neighbor I encountered on my way home mentioned in hushed tones that the house had a reputation for giving people the creeps. She quickly changed the subject, though, and diverted the conversation to more neutral territory. I sensed she didn't want to talk about it further as darkness fell again. My nerves started tingling with anticipation. I left all the downstairs lights on, determined not to let my imagination run wild in the shadows. I checked every door and window, testing the locks multiple times. Despite these efforts, an unease settled in my stomach like a knot. My mind wandered, replaying the twisting doorknob over and over, amplifying the memory until it felt like a threat I couldn't escape when I finally went to bed. Exhaustion fought with apprehension, but eventually sleep seized me. The night was silent at first, so silent that my ears strained against the absence of noise. Then a soft thumping began, like a muffled knock. It was so faint that at first I believed it was my pulse pounding in my ears, but as it grew louder, I realized it was coming from behind the walls, moving at irregular intervals, sometimes times near my headboard, sometimes seeming to shuffle toward the ceiling. My body tensed, and I felt the hairs on my arms prickle again. My breath stuttered in shallow gasps. I wanted to jump out of bed, but I couldn't summon the courage to fling my door open and chase the sound in the dark instead. I lay there, skin clammy, waiting for morning. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless nightmare. Fueled sleep over the next several nights, the strange incidents compounded. The faint thumping evolved into scratching sounds emanating from behind the walls. A rancid odor began to waft through the kitchen whenever I flicked on the light, only to vanish. Moments later, a cold spot developed in the upstairs hallway directly in front of the door to a small linen closet. Each time I passed it, my breath turned to fog in the air and my body was racked by violent shivering. I considered whether there could be mold, a draft, or a hidden vent, but nothing logical accounted for the intensity or suddenness of that chill one evening. As I approached the closet to investigate, my flashlight flickered erratically, casting wild shadows across the walls. A buzzing sensation coursed through my arm, making me drop the flashlight before I could pick it up. The closet door rattled violently. My knees nearly buckled with fear, and my heart pounded so hard that black spots danced in my vision. I retreated to my bedroom room, slamming the door. My hands trembled so badly I had trouble locking it. I could feel a tingling under my skin as though adrenaline surged through every cell, making me lightheaded. In that moment, I recognized that it wasn't just the house's age causing these events. There was a presence, a powerful, malevolent force that wanted me to feel its anger or its anguish, or both. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if stress was leading me to hallucinations. My job had been intense lately and money was always tight. So maybe my nerves were frayed, yet as much as I tried to dismiss the events, the physical sensations were too real. The doorknob turning in my hand, the freezing cold spot, the nauseating stink that came and went with no trace. Each of those experiences left me drained on edge, convinced that something beyond the realm of explanation was targeting me. One particularly harrowing night, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sounds of frantic movement. Downstairs, it resembled heavy footsteps pacing through the living room, accompanied by muffled bangs as if furniture was being shoved or toppled. Despite how terrifying that might have been for anyone else, a strange cold determination settled over me. I decided that I couldn't keep cowering in my room. I picked up a metal flashlight, my only real weapon, and forced myself to descend the stairs. My heart thundered, my breathing quick and shallow. My palms left sweat stains on the flashlight's grip. When I reached the living room, I found it in perfect order. No chairs overturned, no furniture moved. Not a single rug out of place. The only sign of disturbance was the thick coat of dust, dancing in the beam of my flashlight as though the air had been violently stirred. Just moments before then, from the corner of my vision, I saw a shape flicker by the window, a human-like silhouette that vanished the instant I whirled around to confront it. For one heart-stopping second, I thought I felt something brush against my shoulder. A breath of cold air slid across my neck, and I let out a shuddering gasp. My stomach twisted with revulsion, and I nearly stumbled backward, my legs weak from fear. I spent the following day in a stupor, eyes blurry from lack of sleep, nerves so frazzled that even the hum of the refrigerator made me jump. I remember telling a friend on the phone in as casual a tone as I could manage that maybe it was time for me to contact someone with expertise in these matters. My friend suggested over the phone in a vague, uncertain way that I might want to have the house inspected for structural issues, or to see if there was some scientific explanation, though. He didn't say the words out loud. I sensed he suspected something else might be going on, perhaps something best handled by a medium or a spiritual healer after hanging up. I felt a surge of desperation. I could not continue living like this before I could act on that desperation. The house made a move of its own late that afternoon. An oppressive feeling of dread overwhelmed me as I walked into the upstairs hallway. The cold spot was back stronger than ever, and I was hit with the unmistakable sense of being watched. It felt as though eyes were boring into my back. Following my every move, I spun around, seeing no one. But the linen closet door creaked open on its own, revealing shadowy darkness within. A foul stench billowed out, making my stomach churn. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dancing on shelves lined with old towels. Something behind those towels drew my focus, a section of plaster that looked uneven, almost wet. My pulse quickened as I reached out, pushing the towels aside. The plaster practically crumbled at my touch, closing a narrow gap in the wall. It was pitch black, but the smell was stronger here. Decay mingled with something sour. I shone the flashlight, and the beam landed on a small recess where something glinted. Steeling myself, I reached in and pulled out a dusty metal box. The lid was slightly ajar. Inside were yellowed photographs, letters, and bits of tarnished jewelry. The letters were written in a neat hand, detailing repeated experiences in the house. Footsteps, whispers at night, doors slamming. It was as though I was reading my own account, but from someone who had lived here decades before me. A wave of nausea hit me. My vision blurred momentarily, and my heartbeat accelerated so violently I thought I might faint. The letters ended abruptly, with the writer explaining they were leaving the house for good. No mention of what they believed was tormenting them. Only that they couldn't bear it any longer, their parting note read in scrolled handwriting that if anyone found this box, they should do the same. My chest felt tight, and I forced myself to breathe slowly to avoid spiraling into a panic attack. I realized then that I wasn't just reading a relic of the past, I was confronting my own terrifying present. A wave of dread poured through me, cold as ice water. The words felt like a direct warning from someone who had endured what I was enduring. The walls seemed to close in, and every sound in the house magnified the drip of the faucet, the hum of the electricity, the frantic pounding of my heart, clutching the box. I made a decision I would not let this presence consume me with fear. It was time to go. I gathered the items that mattered most. My wallet phone, a change of clothes. The rational part of my mind told me to grab more, but I didn't dare stay a minute longer than necessary. My lungs felt like they were on fire. From panting in short, sharp bursts with trembling hands, I walked down the stairs, half expecting the door to the outside to slam shut or lock itself, but it didn't. There was only a quiet sense of anticipation in the air, as if the entity within the walls was watching to see if I would run or stand my ground. When I reached the front door, I felt a final rush of cold behind me, a presence so close it sent goosebumps rippling across my skin. For the briefest moment, I sensed something looming over my shoulder, an unseen shape that radiated malice and desperation. My heart thudded painfully, and I gripped the doorknob, flinging the door open with more force than necessary. It crashed against the wall, letting a flood of cool night air wash over me like a cleansing wave. I stepped outside and turned to face the interior in the glow from the streetlight. The foyer looked innocently old, just a worn entryway in a house that needed care, yet I knew what lay beyond that veneer. There was a malevolence in those walls that no amount of renovation could erase. Even standing on the threshold, my skin prickled, and the small hairs at the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like the house itself was breathing slowly, a living, pulsing entity, resentful of my departure. I left that night, not bothering to lock the door behind me. My pulse gradually slowed as I walked down the sidewalk, getting farther from the porch. I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders with each step. Yet even now, I can't completely shake the oppressive sensation that clung to me during those final moments. Sometimes I catch myself checking over my shoulder in my new place, scanning for flickers of movement in the corners or listening for that telltale scratching. Behind the walls, a part of me fears that if I stop being vigilant, whatever lurked in that house will find me again, or that I might discover one day it never really let me go. I may have escaped physically unscathed, but my psyche bears the scars of what I experienced in that old Victorian, the claustrophobic darkness, the twisting doorknob in the middle of the night, and the silent, suffocating presence. Behind the walls remain lodged in my memory. I still can't explain what happened in that place, whether it was some restless spirit or just my overwrought mind. All I know is that when the house decided to make itself known, it did so in ways that defied rational thought and left me terrified to the core. Even now, recalling those nights makes my chest tighten. Fear rattles in my bones like an echo of the house's incessant haunting groans. Though I walked away, part of me stayed behind in that musty hallway where the air was perpetually stale and shadows moved of their own accord. I sometimes wake in a cold sweat, convinced I hear a door slamming somewhere far below my bedroom, followed by the slow, deliberate turn of a doorknob. And in those moments, I wonder if I'll ever truly be free from the memory of that place, or if it will forever remain a shadow at the corner of my vision, waiting for the day I let my guard down. Just enough to let it back in the fluorescent lights in the factory corridor always seemed to hum in discord, a low electric buzz that clawed at my nerves whenever I was alone on that particular night. I remember feeling the weight of the silence between those pulsating lights. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't really quiet at all, more like a vacuum where every step reverberated off the high ceilings and distant walls. I had grown used to working nights, used to the echo of my own footsteps, used to checking corners. Just to be sure I wasn't imagining things lurking in the shadows, but that night felt different from the start. There was a suffocating pressure in the air, a nagging sense that I wasn't the only one haunting those corridors. I clocked in just before midnight, the usual routine. The factory operated 24 hours a day, churning out machinery parts with an endless mechanical roar. that sometimes stopped making sense. If I listened too closely, my shift was typically spent walking the perimeter, making sure the machines were running smoothly and the emergency systems were in check. The managers liked to have someone on site who could react to power outages, accidents, or the occasional short circuit that rattled the production line. I never minded the loneliness. In some ways, it was a relief not to be stuck in a crowd. Yet that night, loneliness became something else, a primal fear of emptiness. An hour into my shift, I noticed an emergency light in the far corridor flickering ominously. Its pale dying glow illuminated a narrow stretch of wall revealing scuffed paint and years of grime where people rarely walked. I thought it was just a loose connection or an old bulb. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the way it kept sputtering, flashing erratically gave me a gnawing feeling. In the pit of my stomach, I decided to change the bulb right away, mostly to prevent any potential electrical issues, but also to shake off the uneasy sensation that kept crawling up my spine as I approached. I heard a faint tap-tap echo through the corridor. It might have been the sound of dripping water from one of the exposed pipes overhead. The building was old, and random noises were not unusual. Still, something about that rhythm made my heart pound. I tried to ignore it. Focusing instead on the flickering light above me, I dragged a small stepladder closer, carefully climbed up, and began unscrewing the old bulb. Halfway through the process, I glanced down the corridor to ensure nothing was rolling toward me. Forklifts and pallet jacks sometimes got left out, and I didn't want to be in anyone's path. That's when I saw it, a shadow on the far wall, distinctly human in shape, standing perfectly still. I froze at first. I assumed it had to be my own silhouette cast by the sporadic light. But the angle was all wrong. I leaned left, leaned right, wiggled my arm slightly. My own shadow should have shifted too, but this one didn't budge. It remained static, like a dark stain on the concrete blocks, as if it were watching me. My pulse raced. My fingers felt clammy against the ladder rungs, and I had to steady my breathing. I tried to rationalize. Maybe there was another light source behind me or some trick of perspective. I glanced around for anything that could project such a shape, but there was nothing except the occasional overhead lamp and the flickering emergency bulb as I resumed unscrewing the old light. I caught another glimpse. The shape had moved not by a large distance, but enough to notice it wasn't a graceful shift. More like a sudden jerk, as though it had stepped through the wall and now hovered half inside, half outside. I nearly dropped the replacement bulb. My heart hammered so loudly I could feel the throbbing in my ears. I forced myself to breathe through my nose, trying to stay calm. The bulb needed to be replaced, so I focused on that task, thinking that once I had a steady light, I could get a better look the moment I fit the new bulb in its socket and twisted it tight. The corridor lit up in a harsh fluorescent wash. I looked back at the wall. The shadow was gone. Every hair on my body stood on end. Even though the shape had vanished, I felt sure that I was not alone. The corridor seemed to breathe in unison with me, as if alive and aware. My palms were slick with sweat, and my heartbeat pounded in my throat. I told myself that exhaustion was playing tricks, that maybe I needed a break, but I couldn't shake the lingering dread that clung to me like a second skin. I climbed down and returned the ladder to the maintenance closet on my way. I passed one of the break rooms. A coworker was inside finishing a cup of coffee. He gave me a quick glance and asked, indirectly, if I felt okay. Noticing I looked pale, I nodded and mumbled something about a weird flickering light that had startled me. He shrugged sympathetically and mentioned that the old corridors could be creepy at night. He didn't seem alarmed, so I tried to calm myself, but the sensation of being watched refused to dissipate, determined to keep to my routine. I made my rounds through various production areas. Conveyor belts rattled, machines clanged, and the overhead lights buzzed like insects. I checked each station's gauges and noted the readings in my logbook. The mechanical den was almost comforting compared to the unnatural silence of that far, far corridor. Yet every so often I swore I saw something or someone just out of my peripheral vision. It was always a fleeting shadow slipping into a corner, a momentary flicker. Beyond a stack of crates, each time I whipped around I found nothing but empty walkways. The paranoia built. Steadily, my breathing grew shallow whenever I entered a dimly lit area. My hands trembled and a slick sweat coated my back. The entire factory felt wrong, as if it were pulsing with a hidden heartbeat, synchronized to my own. Panicked several times, I stopped to listen, certain I would hear footsteps behind me every time I heard only the droning hum of distant machinery by 2 a.m. I'd circled back near that corridor. I felt compelled to check it again to prove to myself there was a perfectly logical explanation for the shadow. The new emergency light shone brightly over the spot, making the hallway almost too bright. In that single patch, everywhere else was cast in gloom. I stood there, eyes scanning the length of the wall. Noticing the chipped bricks and rust-colored stains near the floor, an odd stench lingered like old metal and damp cloth. My stomach tightened as I stood in that spot. The emergency light flickered just once like a faint pulse, and in that fraction of a second I saw the shadow reappear. It wasn't on the wall this time. It seemed to be standing a few feet away, not attached to any physical form I could see. It hovered there, a silhouette with indistinct edges darker than the surrounding gloom. I could swear it faced me, though it had no discernible features. A paralytic wave of fear rippled through me, and my muscles tensed so hard I almost couldn't move. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the one before. I felt my breath catch, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead for a moment. I considered running, just sprinting away from that thing, but a strange fascination rooted me to the spot. I wanted to understand it, or at least confirm it was really there. My mind scrambled for logical explanations, maybe a trick of the lighting or a temporary burn-in on my retinas, but I kept seeing it unmoving yet undeniably present. The overhead lamp flickered once more, and in that brief strobe of darkness, the silhouette disappeared. I forced myself to move every step, a battle against the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, lungs tight as if I'd run a marathon. My mouth felt dry and my tongue stuck to the roof in my mind. I replayed the image repeatedly, questioning what I had seen. Could it have been a person? If so, where did they go? If not, what was I dealing with? I drifted into a maintenance bay adjacent to the corridor, the walls. There were LED with tool racks and half-finished repairs. My plan was to check that everything was in order, hoping the familiarity of the tools would ground me. The overhead lamp gave off a faint hum, but I heard another sound beneath it, a rhythmic dripping as if someone was tapping a metal pipe. Somewhere above my fingers tingled with the urge to turn on every light in the room to banish the gloom that slithered in the corners. I started to feel a slight pressure in my head, as though the air was thinning. My vision blurred for a moment, and I shook my head to refocus. That's when I caught a glimpse of movement near the tool racks. A shape lingered behind a row of shelves, peering at me through the gaps. I couldn't see any eyes yet. The sense of being watched was overpowering my throat. Constricted, and I felt like a cornered animal, every instinct screaming to flee. I backed away, my chest so tight I could hardly breathe. The shape glided out from behind the shelves, closer now, but still impossible to define. It was as if the air itself had darkened, forming a void that flexed and pulsed. My heart pounded so violently that I felt nauseated. I tried to speak, maybe to call out, but my voice wouldn't come. Silence pressed in my mind. I ordered my legs to move, and finally they obeyed. I stumbled back into the corridor, half running, half staggering my foot. Steps echoed insanely, slapping the concrete floor with frenzied force. At every turn, I sensed that presence behind me, as if it were following just outside my field of vision. My peripheral caught hints of a flicker or glimmer of darkness that vanished whenever I spun around. Eventually, I reached the main production floor. The cacophony of the machines felt like a blessing, a wall of sound that drowned out my fear. For a moment, workers were stationed at intervals, each busy with their tasks. They paid little attention to me as I approached, though a few seemed concerned by my distraught expression. One of them asked indirectly if I needed to sit down. I nodded. Deciding it would be best to take a short break, I found a secluded corner behind stacked pallets, trying to steady my breathing. My clothes clung to my damp skin, and my hands shook uncontrollably. The sense of something trailing me remained like a pair of eyes locked onto the back of my skull as the minutes ticked by. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Perhaps the flickering lights and labyrinth of corridors had turned my imagination against me. Still, each time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette. My body wouldn't stop trembling. The hum of the factory became distant and hollow, as if I were hearing it underwater. Finally, I decided I couldn't spend the rest of my shift cowering. I needed some form of closure. Forcing my quivering legs to move, I headed back to that corridor one. Last time, determined to confront whatever was there. Even if it was only in my mind, the drive for answers outmatched my fear. At least for that moment when I arrived, the corridor was eerily silent. The new emergency light shone steady, revealing every grimy detail of the walls. The shadows stretched out long and thin, merging near the far end. My heart throbbed in my chest, but I forced myself to walk forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. About halfway down, I heard a faint whisper. Soft as a breeze sliding through cracks, it was unintelligible, yet it raised the hair on the back of my neck. I stopped and scanned the hallway, waiting. The light flickered once, briefly plunging the corridor into dimness in that heartbeat of near dark. I saw the silhouette again, just inches from me this time, towering silent and impossibly black. A jolt of pure terror coursed through me. I stumbled back, nearly falling. My pulse raced out of control, pounding like thunder. A primal surge of fight or flight erupted inside me. Adrenaline demanded that I defend myself, but against what my mouth was dry, my hands tingled and my breathing sounded ragged to my own ears. I steadied myself against the wall, and in the steady glow that followed, the shape was gone again. Only my own frantic breathing and the flickering light remained, though I saw nothing. The feeling of another presence was overwhelming. My instinct screamed that something was there just beyond my field of vision, waiting for my next move. I took a deep breath and willed myself to speak, though my voice came out in a raspy hiss. I demanded that if something was there, it show itself. The corridor remained silent, except for a metallic dripping. In the distance, a wave of dread rolled through me, as if the entire building was holding its breath. Waiting, in the end, I realized I couldn't withstand that confrontation any longer. There was no question of courage. It was as if the air itself had become thick with foreboding. Pressing down on my chest, my mind, rational or not, believed this place harbored a presence. I couldn't explain. I turned and walked away, forcing my trembling legs to carry me. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure behind me. All I saw was the bright glow of the emergency light steadily illuminating an empty corridor. I finished my shift. Feeling drained both physically and mentally, my supervisor asked indirectly about my condition. Concerned by my perspiration and shaking hands, I offered a vague explanation about a near accident with a piece of machinery, not daring to say anything that would make me sound unhinged. The truth was lodged somewhere in my own mind, and I wasn't even sure I believed it. Still, I knew in my gut that whatever I had seen was real, at least real enough to haunt me now. Whenever I look back, I can still feel the prickling sensation at the base of my skull, as if that shadow still watches me from behind some invisible veil. I never spoke openly about it again. I continued my routine for the remainder of my time at the F factory, meticulously avoiding that corridor whenever possible. When avoidance wasn't an option, I moved through it as fast as I could, eyes forward, doing my best not to look at the walls. Yet even with my gaze locked ahead, I would still sense it there. A silent silhouette waiting in the periphery of my vision, challenging my sanity. It never attacked me, never touched me in any tangible way, but the quiet, oppressive aura it projected was enough to keep me on edge every moment I spent in that place. It became the ever-present menace. In my mind, a question that gwed at my sanity was, I truly seeing something supernatural, or had the long hours and the isolation chipped away at my perception of reality? To this day, I can't shake the feeling that it followed me. Sometimes I catch a shadow at the corner of my eye in my own home or on a dimly lit street, a fleeting shape, a flicker of movement, a sharp chill in the air, when there should be none. Each time my heart constricts and my breath catches in my throat. I've convinced myself it's just a trick of the mind, a product of lingering trauma. But deep down, part of me wonders if I've truly escaped that. Lingering doubt is the real horror. It's the knowledge that fear doesn't need to manifest physically to be real. It can be enough for it to exist within you forever. Cold OED in your psyche, reminding you of that shadow in the corridor, static, silent, and all too aware. And if it truly was something beyond my understanding, maybe it still waits in that factory, hidden between the flickering lights and the humming machines ready to appear. When someone else feels just a little too isolated, a little too afraid, a little too alone in the night dire. But the night air felt unnaturally thick, as though the very atmosphere were conspiring to choke me with dread. Even the faint glow of the moon shining high above the preserved woodland near my condominium seemed pale and sickly, more a feeble lamp than any source of comfort. Something about that stretch of trees always gave me pause, but lately I'd found myself returning home far later than usual. My shift at work running into long hours, and each time I approached the parking lot that bordered the woods, I sensed I wasn't alone. The jagged silhouette of trees loomed over me like silent sentinels, as though they stood guard against a secret I was never meant to uncover. My name is Victor. I'm an ordinary man who moved to this condo for a bit of peace and quiet. Initially, I was thrilled that my building backed onto a segment of untouched forest. There was something romantic, almost comforting in the idea of nature being just a few steps away. But recently, that comfort had twisted into a source of persistent unease. It started innocuously. I would park my car late at night, stepping out into the crisp evening air, and think I saw movement between the trees, just a flicker like a shadow that darted out of sight. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the eyes or the wind stirring the underbrush, but it didn't stop. There were nights when I swore I caught a glimpse of a figure leaning around a trunk, almost like someone was peering out, then ducking back in. As soon as I turned my head, rationality told me it was probably a night guard, or maybe some trespasser lost in the darkness. Still, my skin would prickle and a chill would settle in my gut. That lingered long after I'd reached the safety of my front door. One particular evening, I decided I'd had enough. My curiosity and a certain stubborn pride compelled me to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight from the trunk of my car and strode into the tree line, determined to prove to myself there was nothing to fear. The beam of light cut through the dimness, illuminating every gnarled root, every twisted fern, but no sign of a person. No footprints, no branches snapped in an obvious path, and yet as I stood there scanning the darkness, I heard a faint sigh. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. My heart lurched and the hair on my arm stood on end. I whipped the flashlight around in a frantic arc, but all I saw were ancient trunks and thick clusters of leaves. After a minute of tense silence, I retreated. Feeling both foolish and oddly shaken over the next week, my routine didn't change. I still arrived home late, still parked in the same spot, and every night I scanned the woods. Sometimes nothing happened, just the rustle of foliage in the breeze, the quiet hum of distant traffic. Other nights I swore I saw that same shape lurking in the gloom. On one occasion I spotted what looked like a pale arm sliding out from behind a tree, only to vanish as soon as I focused on it. My heart hammered against my chest and my throat went dry. I can't explain why I was so unnerved. It was only a glimpse, a fleeting movement. Yet there was something inherently wrong about it, as if I'd caught sight of a ghost. The rational side of my brain tried to reassure me that it could have been the trunks' bark or a trick of moonlight, but the image of that pale, impossibly thin arm refused to leave me. As days passed, my nerves began to fray. I felt watched sometimes. Even during daylight hours, I'd gaze out from my kitchen window toward that stretch of forest and feel unseen eyes returning my stare. A neighbor once asked me if I was all right. Remarking that I looked pale, I brushed it off, claiming I was just tired, but that lingering sense of being observed weighed heavily on my mind. My sleep became restless. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no discernible reason, convinced that something was standing outside my door or just beyond the window's thin curtain. Of course, there was never anyone there, just an empty hallway, an empty balcony. But in the distant backdrop of my thoughts, the forest lingered like a dark promise, reminding me of that faint sigh and the flash of a pale limb on a particularly cold night. I arrived home with a tension headache throbbing behind my temples. The condo parking lot was deserted as usual, and the lights overhead flickered in that sinister way fluorescent bulbs. Sometimes do I recall stepping out of my car and immediately feeling a shift in the air as though everything had gone unnaturally still. Even the gentle hum of insects seemed to drop off into silence. I looked toward the wood's heart rate already climbing and froze. A shape stood just beyond the first row of trees. It was tall, almost matching my own height, and it had the vaguest outline of a person my chest constricted. I lifted my phone, trying to use its camera light to get a clearer view, but the light didn't reach far enough to reveal more than an indecipherable mass of darkness with my pulse hammering. I inched closer. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow, echoing in my ears. Suddenly, a faint crunch of leaves came from that shape's direction as if it were shifting its weight or taking a step. Adrenaline surged through me and a wave of heat shot through my limbs. I wanted to call out to it. Part of me believed that if I confronted this presence, I could make sense of the fear. But my vocal cords felt paralyzed after a moment that felt interminable. The shape melted backward into the dark. No running, no snapping of branches, just an unnervingly silent retreat. When I reached the spot where it had been, I found nothing but a scattering of dead leaves and the strong scent of damp earth. I swept my phone's light around, but there was only empty forest. That was when I noticed how intensely I was sweating. Despite the evening chill, my shirt clung to my back and my hands were shaking so hard that the phone's light jittered in frantic patterns across the ground. I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, though each inhale felt razor sharp in my lungs. I told myself I would go inside, lock the door, and forget the whole thing. But as I turned to leave, a low sigh, much closer than before, drifted through the silence. It was right behind me. I spun around trembling, only to be met by darkness. Fear flooded my veins, and I ran to my unit without looking back. That night, I barely slept every time I closed my eyes. I was back in the forest, hearing that sigh, picturing something lurking just out of sight. The next day, I tried to confide in an acquaintance who lived a few doors down. He listened politely as I explained the strange sightings and the oppressive feeling that came from the woods. He suggested that maybe local wildlife was to blame. Animals can look humanoid at night. If the light hits them in weird ways, perhaps it was a deer or some lost pet. He tried to sound reassuring, but I noticed how he avoided making eye contact, as though my story unsettled him more than he cared to admit. After that conversation, I felt no better. If anything, my unease spiked. I doubted I was simply mistaking animals for a human shape. Every fiber of my being insisted this was something else. A few evenings later, I attempted a second inspection this time. Just before dusk, I reasoned that the fading daylight might offer enough visibility to dispel my fears. The forest looked less menacing with the sun's last rays filtering through the leaves. I ventured in roughly the same direction I'd gone that first time with my flashlight. The ground felt spongy beneath my sneakers, and the air was damp and cool. Tall shrubs and wide tree trunks obstructed my view, and as I navigated around them, a prickling sensation spread across my neck. It was that primal instinct again telling me I was not alone. My chest tightened when I spotted a crude makeshift arrangement of branches leaning against a massive pine. They almost formed a shelter or a haphazard lean-to. I stepped closer, swallowing the lump in my throat. The interior of that arrangement smelled of rotting leaves and something else, a musty odor that made my stomach churn. I pushed aside a half-broken branch to look inside. There were old damp scraps of fabric on the ground and something that might have been a chipped Kamek mug. My pulse quickened. Someone had clearly spent time here, but who and why? Unease noted at me. The notion of some stranger living in the woods near my home, or even just passing through, was unpleasant but not impossible. Yet something felt off about this shelter. The way the branches were arranged suggested a strange pattern, almost ritualistic, as though they'd been placed with intention rather than slapped together for a quick hideaway. The realization sent a bolt of fear through me. I backed away, nearly tripping over a rot. In my haste, my breath came in sharp gasps and sweat. Beat on my forehead, I forced myself to return to my unit. My nerves were rattled, but I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it was an abandoned campsite or a local trying to observe wildlife incognito. Still, the sense of dread refused to let go. That night, my paranoia was relentless. I felt as though I was on the edge of a precipice, my mind swirling with half-formed questions and half-remembered details. I started to second-guess. Everything, had I really seen an arm, or was it a trick of the light? Could the sigh have been the wind escaping through the dense branches? The more I tried to rationalize it, the more my thoughts circled back to that leaning arrangement of branches, and the pungent scent inside the forest seemed to pulse with a dark vitality. Even from within my condo, I couldn't shake the impression that someone was out there watching. A few days of uneasy calm followed, during which I tried to distract myself with work chores and streaming mindless television shows, but I was always keenly aware of the forest's presence. Especially after dark, I found myself looking out my window, more often checking for movement among the trees. My heart would pound for no reason, my palms clammy as if I were perpetually braced for some awful revelation. Sleep grew increasingly elusive at times. I jolt awake, convinced I heard leaves crunching just outside my window. My skin would go cold, a tingling wave passing from my scalp down to my heels. It was in this heightened state of anxiety that a final incident shattered any remaining sense of normalcy. I was heading home once more under the cover of night eyes, darting nervously to the tree line. The flickering parking lot lights seemed weaker than ever, barely illuminating my path as I reached the spot where I usually paused. That familiar rustling caught my attention. My muscles tensed. I shined my phone's flashlight into the undergrowth. Then I saw it, or perhaps it allowed itself to be seen. A tall figure stood behind one of the thicker trunk's arms, gripping the bark in a way that seemed almost painful, like its fingers were digging into the wood. I couldn't make out its face. It was lost in the shadow cast by overhead branches, but I glimpsed enough of a silhouette to realize it was human, or very close to it. My heart pounded so violently I thought I might faint. My vision narrowed, and every breath felt like drawing in shards of ice. For a moment, the figure didn't move, as if it were content just to watch my reaction. Then, in one fluid motion, it slid around the trunk, appearing into the darkness. I don't remember dropping my phone, but I heard it hit the asphalt. My mind screamed at me to run, yet my legs were locked in place. A numbness began to creep up from my ankles, as if some invisible force wanted me to remain frozen there. Finally, I managed to jerk my body forward, retrieve my phone, and sprint to my front door. My entire torso was drenched in cold sweat by the time I slammed the door shut behind me. That night, I became convinced there was someone in the hallway outside my unit. The floorboards beyond my door creaked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as though footsteps were pacing back and forth. I stood on the other side, ear pressed against the wood, tears of fear stinging my eyes when I dared to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty, and yet the sound continued for hours. I felt trapped, adrenaline coursing through me as I alternated between pressing my ear to the door and pacing in frantic circles around my living room. By the time dawn broke, the noises had stopped. I must have dozed off briefly on the couch, because I awoke with a jolt to find light streaming through the curtains. A wave of relief and exhaustion washed over me. I spent that morning convincing myself I needed to face this presence, whatever it was, and claim back my peace of mind. Determined, I ventured out at midday, stepping into the edge of the forest. Where I had seen the figure, my heart still hammered, but the bright daylight gave me a semblance of courage. I found no fresh footprints, no suspicious debris. Instead, a profound stillness hung over everything, as though the forest itself were waiting with bated breath. I stayed there for nearly an hour, wandering from tree to tree, calling out that if someone was there, they should show themselves, but no one came. Eventually, I headed home, frustrated and tired. Then, just before dusk, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. Leaning against my front door was a single broken branch, similar to those I'd seen forming that unsettling shelter in the woods. It looked deliberately placed, the end splintered into a sharp point. My stomach lurched as I realized it must have been left there while I was inside my home. Fear flared in my chest again, and I felt a hot flush on my face that then turned to pins and needles in my extremities. I decided in that moment I had to leave. At least for a while, I packed a small bag, hands trembling as I threw clothing and essentials together the entire time. I felt eyes on me like I was under constant surveillance. I wondered if the figure was outside, possibly peering through my window or standing in the parking lot. Silently judging my every movement, my chest felt tight and my mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. I finished packing in record time, heart thudding louder with each second as I opened the door to step out. I paused, half expecting to see that figure in the hallway, but it was empty. My footsteps echoed loudly as I hurried to the elevator. The ride down seemed interminable, each floor passing with agonizing slowness. I couldn't stop picturing the figure from the night before, how it had seemed almost hungry for my fear. My skin tingled at the memory. At last I exited into the parking lot. The sun was beginning to set, and long shadows stretched across the asphalt for a moment. I stood there scanning the tree line, and in that glance I felt it again, that suffocating sensation of being watched. The shadows in the forest swirled together, an impenetrable wall of black. My lungs burned as though I couldn't draw in enough air. I forced my legs to move, half expecting to see a pale arm or a tall silhouette emerging from the tree line, but nothing came. I climbed into my car and started the engine, refusing to look over my shoulder as I pulled away. My headlights grazed the first few trunks of the forest. Just before I fully turned the corner, I caught the briefest flicker of movement, a shifting darkness that might have been a person or might have been my imagination. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white without a second thought. I floored the gas and left that unnerving place behind. I don't know exactly what I encountered in those woods or why it seemed to fixate on me. Perhaps it was all in my head, a product of exhaustion and stress. Perhaps it was something far stranger, an entity tied to the land in ways I can't begin to comprehend. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I can still see that motionless silhouette and feel its gaze following me as I retreat. It haunts me in the moments between sleep and waking, whispering that it's still out there waiting for me to return, though I've put miles between myself and that condo. I can't escape the sense of looming dread. The image of that broken branch propped against my door remains burned into my memory, an unmistakable sign that something wanted me gone, or wanted me to know it could reach me wherever I was sometimes. When the night is quiet and I'm alone, I hear that faint sigh echoing in the back of my mind. It lingers like a cold breath against my ear, a reminder that, real or not, some horrors refuse to fade. And despite escaping that place, I'm left with the unsettling knowledge that I only postponed the inevitable. A part of me believes that one night, no matter how far away I may be, I will sense movement in the darkness, shapes skulking between silent trees, and when that day comes, I'll be forced to face the terror again. My heart pounding, my mouth dry, my skin prickling with sweat. Even now I glance into the shadows outside my window and wonder if that figure is still there, an eternal watchman silently measuring each fearful beat of my heart. Every night in this old building, the air seems to turn thick and stale the moment darkness settles, as if it's charged with some malignant presence. I can't quite name the place. Hums with a quiet tension that seeps into my bones, tightening my chest and making every breath feel labored. Even from the street, I remember staring up at the weathered facade and wondering why the lights in the top floor windows flickered so erratically, as if someone or something paced back and forth behind the glass. I told myself it was just the age of the building, shoddy wiring perhaps, or the wind rattling the old frames. But once I moved in and found out that the top floor was nothing more than a deserted terrace, a persistent dread began to coil inside my chest. Whispering that I was not alone here, I had taken an entire floor to myself. A long hallway lined with 4 empty apartments, all under renovation, paid for by a meager arrangement with the property owner. Supposedly, I was to remain on site, keep an eye on the place, and report any suspicious activity to the building manager. At first, it sounded ideal privacy in the midst of a bustling city center, but from the first night I realized my new living situation might be more than I bargained for. I remember lying in bed on that initial evening, the gloom of the unlit corridor just outside my bedroom. Creeping under the door, my heart kicked against my ribs in sin with every noise. Pipes gurgled deep in the walls, and the wind made the ancient windows creak I could handle. These typical old building sounds, but then above me something much more deliberate reverberated slow, methodical steps. Crossing from one side of the ceiling to the other, there shouldn't have been anyone up there, not at midnight, and certainly not in a place that was supposedly just an empty terrace, yet the footsteps were unmistakably human in their weight and tempo. That first night I tried to pass it off as my imagination or perhaps some strange echo traveling through the old pipes. Still, the hair on the back of my neck prickled and my hands felt clammy against the sheets. My throat went dry as I listened in absolute stillness, hoping the sound would vanish. Eventually, the footsteps paused, and for a moment I began to relax, but just as my body slackened, the footsteps resumed. Crossing back in the opposite direction, the tension surged again in my temples, and I lay there until morning, paralyzed by the realization that something up there was moving around of its own accord. When daylight came, my fear felt somewhat laughable. I told myself the mind can play wicked tricks in the stillness of night. Determined to dismiss the whole episode as a silly reaction to an unfamiliar setting, I went about my day trying to gather more information about the building. The caretaker, an older man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, explained that the top floor had no tenants. He insisted it was merely a barren terrace, and no one ever went up there except occasionally to check for leaks or to repair the old water tank. Even so, I pressed him, describing the footsteps I had heard. He muttered that I must have been mistaken, perhaps the wind or someone on the neighboring roof. His dismissive tone made my stomach clench with annoyance, but I told myself there was no reason to disbelieve him that night. I went to bed early more out of anxiety than fatigue. I wanted to prove to myself that the previous night's sounds were just a figment of my overactive imagination. But the instant the lights went out, a heavy sense of foreboding settled in the pit of my stomach, as if the darkness itself had weight and presence. My heart rate spiked the moment I heard the first faint thud from above. Again, I tried to rationalize it. Old beams, contracting metal supports shifting in, then the soft thuds became distinctly human. Footsteps, they were slow yet purposeful, moving in a pattern that traced the length of my ceiling. My breathing turned ragged. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, each beat like a drum, heralding something I couldn't see. My palms began to sweat, and I clutched my blanket so tightly that my knuckles went numb. I was too frightened to move. If the footsteps were indeed from a person, that meant somebody had lied. If they weren't from a person, then I had to consider something else entirely. Something I was not prepared to face in the following days. I found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything besides the uninvited company. Above, I tried investigating the building's history, searching for any mention of unexplained events or long-gone tenants, but records were sparse. The caretaker shrugged off my inquiries, reiterating only that the top floor was off-limits, and had been so for years. He offered no further details, and each time I mentioned the footsteps, his gaze drifted away as if he feared that acknowledging my concerns would somehow make them real. I began feeling an unshakable presence throughout the day, not just at night in the hallways. I often sensed a light shift in the air behind me, as though someone was standing just over my shoulder. I'd spin around my heart, seizing in my chest, only to see peeling paint on the walls and the same burnt-out light bulbs overhead. The sound of my own breath filled my ears, quickening with each false alarm. Yet, even when I saw no one there, a lingering heaviness remained, as if the corridor itself pulsed with unseen eyes. A week in my nights became a battleground of unnerving sounds and racing thoughts. The footsteps continued above me, sometimes for hours. If I tried to ignore them, they only grew louder, more insistent at times, resembling frantic pacing. My heart would pound violently. Sometimes I'd clasp my hand over my mouth, trying to steady my breathing as though not to alert whatever was there that I was listening. My exhaustion grew so severe I found myself drifting off to sleep at random times during the day, only to be jarred awake by the echo of those footsteps in my mind. At one point, in an attempt to reclaim my sanity, I decided to go upstairs during the day. I told myself I needed proof. Either I would find some mischief maker or confirm that I was losing my grip. The caretaker had given me a dismissive wave earlier, though he mentioned that the terrace door was usually locked indeed. When I got there, I found a heavy metal door with a rusted padlock. I pulled on it, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned in, pressing my ear against the cool metal, struggling to catch any sign of life on the other side. The wind whistled through the cracks, and I heard only the city noise echoing from far below. No footsteps, no voices, nothing to confirm my late-night terrors. This contradiction unsettled me further. How could I hear loud stomps at night? If it was so deserted by day, my paranoia started spilling into my everyday life. I became convinced that people in the lobby or on the sidewalk were eyeing me strangely as though they knew I was unraveling and were just too polite or frightened to mention it. Even on the nights when the footsteps were faint, I felt them drilling into my nerves. I found myself trembling uncontrollably, my muscles perpetually coiled, ready to flee at the slightest change in the atmosphere one evening, as the city lights outside blurred into a gray drizzle of rain against the windows. I was jolted by a sudden clang above my living room. It was as if something heavy had been dragged across the terrace. My heart hammered so hard I could hardly breathe. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and stepped into the corridor. The overhead lights flickered ominously, my breathing grew shallower with each flicker, and my skin prickled in goosebumps. It felt like the building itself was breathing its old walls, wheezing in tune with my pulse. While I crept toward my living room, the footsteps started up again. Only now they were more rapid, as if someone was pacing in agitation. My mind conjured all sorts of twisted scenarios, some vagrant living there undetected, or perhaps something far less human. Prowling around the caretaker's refusal to engage with my questions suddenly felt more sinister. Was he hiding something? I approached the tall window that gave a partial view of the upper structure. Rain pelted the glass. My breath fogged the pane as I peered upward. The sky was a black sea illuminated only by the occasional glow of city lights. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I thought I saw movement, a dark silhouette, crossing in front of a small maintenance light on the roof. My heartbeat thundered. I strained my eyes, my forehead pressed so firmly against the window that it felt cold and damp. But the silhouette didn't reappear. Maybe it had never been there at all. Those next hours were the worst. So far, the footsteps seemed to follow me every time I changed rooms. My bedroom felt claustrophobic, the stale air thick with dread. My chest tightened painfully as if something was squeezing my lungs. I tried turning the lights on and off, but the overhead bulb flickered and died. Darkness engulfed my space. My mouth went dry and my fingers trembled so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I'd grabbed the narrow beam of light from that small device, tremor along with my shaking hand dancing across every corner of the room. But no matter where I pointed it, I couldn't shake the impression that something was right behind me out of sight. Desperate for any sense of security, I turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the unrelenting thumps above the muffled chatter of commercials. Did little to calm my nerves. After a moment, I realized the footsteps had ceased. I exhaled a shaking breath, my shoulders sagging with relief, but that relief was short-lived. A single deafening stomp resounded directly above my head as if something enormous had just landed there. I gasped, stumbling backward into a table. The impact knocked a lamp to the floor with a crash. My throat constricted and cold sweat trickled down my SP spine. Adrenaline flooded my veins, making me elated. The dryness in my mouth was so intense that my tongue felt glued to the roof. I was too scared to even retrieve the lamp. At that moment, I recalled the caretaker's words about the terrace being locked. If the door was locked, what was up there? The question turned in my mind like a spinning top, each rotation tightening my fear. It dawned on me that perhaps a lock wouldn't stop. Whatever was causing these footsteps, my rational mind warred with a growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the building itself. I barely slept that night, and when I did doze off from sheer exhaustion, I dreamt of twisting corridors and tall shadows looming over me in these nightmares. The floors above were an endless maze, and no matter how far I ran, the footsteps drew closer. I woke drenched in sweat, with my heart in my throat, only to find my surroundings equally oppressive. In reality, the caretaker noticed my haggard appearance the next morning, asking indirectly if I was sleeping poorly. He suggested that old buildings can sometimes amplify everyday city noises. I told him I wasn't convinced the footsteps were too real. He responded that I should perhaps keep my windows closed or play some music to drown out the wind. My teeth clenched in frustration. I knew he was avoiding the truth that evening. Exhausted and nearly at my breaking point, I resolved to confront whatever was upstairs. Hadn't I waited until midnight? Listening as the footsteps started their usual pattern, I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. While I mustered the courage to go back to the terrace door with a set of tools I'd borrowed from the maintenance closet, I reasoned that if I could just open the lock, I'd uncover the truth. Even if it scared me senseless, I climbed the final flight of stairs every step, an echo that seemed to mock me. My flashlight shook in my hand, illuminating the chipped paint of the stairwell. When I reached the terrace door, I fumbled with the lock for what felt like ages. My palms were slick with sweat, and the tools slipped in my grip. Eventually, the lock clicked. My stomach flipped as I realized I was about to face whatever had been haunting me. I pulled the heavy door open. A gust of cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet concrete and something else, an earthy, musty odor that reminded me of old basements and decaying spaces. My heart was in my throat wrote as I stepped out onto the terrace. The entire space was empty. Rainwater pulled in corners, reflecting the ghostly glow of distant city lights. I swung my flashlight around, searching for any sign of movement. The wind howled, whipping against my face and reminding me of how exposed I was. My eyes darted to the far edges of the terrace, half expecting a shape to appear, but there was only a deserted stretch of cracked flooring. Then, near a small service door leading to the water tanks, I heard a shuffle of footsteps so faint I nearly missed it. My breath caught and I inched forward. As I approached, the footsteps seemed to retreat, leading me around the corner of a half wall that sheltered the water tank pipes. My pulse thundered and my fingers ached from gripping the flashlight. I swept the beam in front of me, fully anticipating to see an intruder or some kind of presence, but no one was there. I stood alone in the wind, trembling chest heaving, a stinging sensation behind my eyes. From the strain of trying to see through the darkness, then I heard a sudden scraping sound right behind me, like a shoe dragging across the floor. I spun around so quickly I nearly lost my footing. The flashlight illuminated only swirling dust and rain. There was nothing, no figure, no sign of life. Yet the air felt charged, crackling with a silent malevolence. My heart hammered so wildly that it hurt. I didn't know what else to do except flee. I turned and sprinted back to the door, each footstep echoing on the drenched concrete. My lungs burned by the time I reached the stairwell, and I yanked the door shut behind me, fumbling with the broken lock. I darted down the stairs, not caring about the noise the building's corridors felt narrower than ever, walls closing in on me as I stumbled back into my apartment. In that moment, I realized with horrifying clarity that the footsteps might not belong to any living person at all. Something unseen roamed that empty terrace, unbound by locked doors and rational explanations. I sank onto my couch, struggling to breathe. Every muscle in my body quivered. A part of me wanted to pack up my things and never look back. Another part, driven by a strange fascination, wanted to stay there. Was a morbid curiosity about what lurked above a burning need to understand, to prove I wasn't insane. When dawn broke, I made my decision. I could no longer keep watch in this place, especially if it meant slowly losing my mind before the sun was fully up. I began gathering my belongings. My heart still hammered in my chest, and my ears rang with phantom sounds of footsteps. But I was resolute as I headed for the front door. A final tremor of dread coursed through me as if the building itself disapproved of my departure. The corridor light flickered one last time, the shadows along the walls seeming to reach out and grip me. I walked past the caretaker's office, left the key, and explained in flat, emotionless tones that I couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't argue, his eyes held a hint of resigned understanding as though he'd seen this happen before and simply accepted it. I felt an icy wave of discomfort, realizing my experience was likely not unique. Stepping outside, the early morning light felt harsh and unwelcoming, but at least it was real. My breath steadied as I put distance between myself and the old building, yet a part of my mind kept racing, replaying every sound, every shadow, every unexplainable moment. I couldn't shake the impression that the footsteps might follow me, no matter where I went. Even now, I can't entirely convince myself that everything I heard was a product of creaking floorboards or my own anxiety. The unsettling truth is that I truly believe something walked above me on that deserted terrace. Whether it was a spirit, a phantom echo from some forgotten past, or a manifestation of my own unraveling psyche, I may never know, but the memory of those footsteps resonates inside me, a disquieting reminder that some places are saturated with energies beyond our comprehension. And though I escaped that building, I carry a lingering sense of being followed, an inkling that one day in some darkened hall or empty rooftop, I might once again hear those measured, deliberate steps coming for me. I felt it the moment I pushed open the library's heavy oak door, a subtle oppressive weight in the air that clung to my skin like damp cobwebs. The fluorescent ceiling lights flickered with a weak, uneven hum, casting elongated shadows across rows of ancient shelves. Before I had even taken a step inside, something told me this place was different at night. It was more than just the stillness. It was the sense that each corridor held its breath, watchful and waiting. When I volunteered for the late shift at the Garrison Historical Library, I never expected to find myself questioning not just my nerves, but my very sanity. I remember signing up because I wanted experience in archival work. The library was known for its impressive collection of rare manuscripts, though only a handful of people ever seemed to come by to study them. The building itself was a three-story stone structure dating back to the early 1900s. Its facade was proud, almost regal, and the interior was built in a grand style, polished marble floors, sweeping staircases, iron railings that curled like vines. By day, it felt dignified and secure. By night, the same features took on a darker edge. The marble seemed cold. The staircases became twisting paths to unknown places, and those kuru railings reminded me of skeletal hands. I usually worked on the first floor, helping to file new arrivals or reorganize the archives that students and researchers used. The first few weeks were calm. I often heard a fellow volunteer remark that the library was pleasantly quiet. After sundown, that it was the perfect environment for meticulous organization. I tried to agree, though from the start I had an inexplicable sense of being observed whenever I put a book back on the shelf. Sometimes I would turn around, anticipating a patron or another volunteer, only to find the corridor empty. Initially, I told myself I was just spooking myself in the hush of those grand halls, but the subtle friction between my nerves and my logic grew stronger. With each passing night during one of my shifts, I was tasked with cataloging some rare texts on the third floor. These books were from the 16th and 17th centuries, many with brittle pages and fading scripts. The third floor was normally sealed off to casual visitors. Only researchers with special permission were allowed there. The door to that area required an old key, heavy and ornate, that I had to sign out from the front desk. The overhead lights in that space were dimmer, and many of the fixtures were original to the building, meaning they buzzed faintly as if on the verge of burning out. I hated that noise. It reminded me of a swarm of insects just out of sight on that particular night. I found myself alone in the library around 10. The guard at the reception desk downstairs had stepped out for a brief break. I heard him say something about wanting to grab a quick cup of coffee from across the street. I swallowed my unease and headed for the stairs. My heart thudded against my ribcage as I climbed, and a chill prickled the back of my neck. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the darkness overhead was pressing down, encouraging me to turn around, but I tried to brush it off. It was just a job, just another flight of stairs as soon as I reached the second floor. Landing a draft of cold air brushed over me. It felt deliberate somehow. Like an unseen figure had passed by, I shivered and paused, looking toward the corridor that led to the main reading room. On that level, silence, just the usual hush of old buildings settling. Perhaps a slight creak of the wooden floor. Taking a slow breath, I continued toward the final staircase that led to the restricted third floor. The overhead light there flickered once, and the gloom made the steps look steeper than I remembered. Halfway up, I felt a tingling unease crawl across my skin. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the banister to steady myself. That was when I saw it, a hand, pale, almost translucent, resting on the iron rail a few steps above me. My lungs seized for a split second. I thought someone was leaning on the banister, but there was no arm, no shoulder, no body, just that single disembodied hand. My pulse hammered in my ears. Every beat felt like a drum pounding inside my head. I froze, afraid that if I moved, whatever it was might notice me. The hand was motionless, its fingers curled delicately around the iron. The skin, if that's what it truly was, had a faint bluish tint for what might have been. Mere seconds, but felt like an eternity. I stared in absolute horror. Then, as though sensing my gaze, the hand vanished. It didn't pull away or dissolve, it simply ceased to be there, as if it had never existed. I couldn't even manage a scream. My throat was tight, and it felt like I'd swallowed shards of ice, trembling. I stood there for a long while, unsure of whether to retreat back down the stairs or press on a voice in my head. Insisted that I must have hallucinated, that it was just a flicker of shadow in imagination. But the goosebumps on my arms, the sweat on my palms, and the dry highness in my mouth confirmed how real it had felt. I considered running downstairs to find the guard, but shame pricked at me. I was a grown man, not a frightened child. If I told him I'd seen a phantom hand on the banister, I might lose any credibility I had. Besides, part of me wondered if the stress and the eerie quiet had just played tricks on my mind in an effort to restore calm. I forced myself to focus on the steps each footfall measured until I reached the third floor door. My hand shook so badly it took me a few tries to fit the key into the lock. The reading room beyond was large, its high ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. Many of those beams were carved with ornate designs so worn by time that they looked like faces melting into the wood. Rows of shelves ran the length of the room, containing countless volumes that smelled of old leather and dust. The overhead lighting was even weaker here, many bulbs either dim or burnt out. I noticed a distinct hush, an absence of sound that bordered on suffocating. My breathing sounded too loud, too ragged. I turned on a small desk lamp near the central table, determined to focus on my work. The library wanted me to update the records of a few manuscripts, verifying their condition and cross-checking references, but all I could think about was that hand. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race anew. My back felt exposed, as though eyes were sliding over me from the dark corners. I started to notice odd details, a stack of books on the far shelf that appeared to have shifted positions since the last time I visited, the faint smell of mildew intensifying in a corner near an old tapestry, and a slight but constant rustling that I couldn't source whenever I stopped to listen. Carefully, the rustling fell silent, only to return in the periphery of my hearing. Moments later, at one point, I thought I saw a shape move in my peripheral vision. I looked up, searching the aisle between two tall shelves, but it was empty. My scalp prickled, and I felt a bead of cold sweat slide down my temple. Forcing a steady breath, I clung to the logical explanation that my mind was on edge and conjuring phantoms out of the gloom. After about an hour of this, my nerves were frayed. I packed up the manuscripts I had managed to catalog and locked them in a special cabinet. My plan was to hurry downstairs and maybe call it a night. That was when I heard a faint scraping sound near the far end of the room, something like nails being dragged across wood. My breathing quickened and my heart pounded so fiercely it almost hurt. I stepped toward the door, intending to leave, but an inexplicable force seemed to draw my attention. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking toward the origin of the sound. Each step felt like it vibrated in my bones. The desk lamp's light couldn't reach that far, so the corners were a murky darkness that seemed to shift with my movements. In that dimness, I caught a glimpse of something near the shelves, a figure too tall to be a person. Its outline faint but unmistakable. It seemed elongated, as though stretched the moment I registered its shape. It slipped out of sight behind a row of ancient folios. My breath came in ragged gasps, yet a compulsion to see it more clearly drove me forward. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but curiosity, or perhaps some primal fear of the unknown, pushed me on, rounding the corner of the shelf. I pointed the narrow beam of my flashlight into the darkness. The light danced across old wooden boards, dust motes swirling in the air. Nothing was there. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by my own thunderous pulse. For a while, I just stood there scanning every inch of the space. Eventually, I whispered a reassurance to myself that maybe it was just a draft. Then I heard a soft sigh. It wasn't mine. I spun around the flashlight beam, jerking wildly across the spines of books. The sigh came again, like a gentle exhalation filled with regret. My nerves felt stretched to a breaking point. The flashlight flickered, and in that instant I sensed movement, like something brushing past me close enough to rustle the loose fabric of my sweater. I yelped, nearly dropping the flashlight, and the beam revealed a swirl of dust in the air, as though something had just disturbed it. I felt my insides turn to ice, whatever was there. It moved with purpose. I backed away, my breath shallow and panicked. My ankles bumped against a chair, and I almost tripped. It was then that I decided I couldn't stay on that floor for another second. I sprinted for the door, my footsteps echoing across the silent reading room. As soon as I reached the staircase, my mind replayed the image of that pallet hand resting on the banister. I couldn't bear to let my fingers touch the same spot, so I pressed my back against the wall, my free hand guiding me unsteadily down the steps. My legs trembled so badly I feared I might tumble headlong when I reached the second floor. I paused, swallowing against the dryness in my throat. The corridor was dark, and the single overhead bulb flickered on and off for a moment. In the strobing light, I thought I saw a faint silhouette at the far end, but it disappeared when the bulb steadied. My heart refused to slow. Each breath felt insufficient, as though the air in the library no longer carried enough oxygen downstairs. The security guard had returned. He stood at the reception desk, sipping coffee. Through the haze of my terror, I heard him ask if I was feeling all right, though in my dad's state it sounded almost muffled. I barely managed to nod and muttered a weak explanation that I felt under the weather. I didn't mention the hand, the figure, or the scraping sounds. My mind spun with questions. Had I genuinely seen something supernatural, or had my imagination spiraled out of control in the oppressive silence of that old library, regardless of the truth I dreaded ever going back to the third floor alone? The next evening, I lingered on the first floor, claiming I needed to reorganize some reference materials. In reality, I just didn't want to go anywhere near that staircase every time I glanced at it. My stomach twisted. I found myself hyper-aware of the building's noises, the whisper of a breeze through the rafters, the subtle groaning of the pipes, the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Each sound set my nerves on edge. Night after night, that sense of being watched returned, especially if I ever strayed too close to the stairs. The recollection of that pale hand burned in my mind. My fear built like pressure in a boiling kettle, threatening to scream. Eventually, I confided in a fellow volunteer using vague terms. I mentioned that I had a bad feeling about the third floor, that something about it made me uneasy. The volunteer just shrugged, saying they also disliked that floor at night. They'd never witnessed anything strange, but they claimed the atmosphere up there was stifling. They had heard rumors of odd occurrences, books misplaced, inexplicable cold spots, even a faint smell of decay that would drift through the aisles and vanish. No one could pinpoint a rational cause. That conversation should have comforted me by confirming that others found the space unsettling, but instead it amplified my anxiety. It meant I wasn't entirely alone in this perception. Something was genuinely off about that place. Something. Beyond mere shadows and drafts, my mind became a storm of death, out in dread. I found myself awake at night replaying the scene of that spectral hand on the banister. I could still see the curve of its fingertips, the uncanny stillness of its pale flesh at times. I worried I was losing my grip, that I'd let a momentary hallucination toy my reality. Last week, an archist asked if I would help pack some fragile volumes for restoration. They were, of course, on the third floor. My stomach lurched at the request. Yet I had no valid excuse to refuse. I decided I couldn't keep letting fear control me. I forced my trembling legs to climb those same stairs, ignoring the way my breath quickened with each step as I approached the final landing. I braced myself, half expecting to see that hand again, but the banister was empty. The corridor silent. My relief was fleeting because every shelf, every shadow seemed alive with anticipation. I powered through car, carefully boxing manuscripts and trying to keep my mind anchored to mundane tasks. The archist was on the second floor, so I was left alone to gather the texts. Each rustle of paper made my heart flutter. I started to feel that prickling sensation on my neck, as though unseen eyes were tracing my every movement. Once or twice I spun around with the irrational conviction that I'd see something lurking behind me. Nothing, just the same. Dusty shelves. Eventually I finished. I practically bolted down the stairs, clutching the box tightly. Ignoring the dryness in my mouth and the sweat dripping down my back. Even now, I can't rationally explain what I experienced. Did I truly see an apparition? Or did my mind construct a phantom from the uneasy quiet of a decrepit library wing? All I know is that some nights as I pack up and prepare to leave, my eyes drift to that curved staircase. The air around it seems colder, the shadows deeper, and sometimes out of the corner of my vision, I think I spot the faint outline of a hand resting languidly on the iron rail. Whenever that happens, I freeze. My heart thunders in my chest, and for a beat or two I can't breathe. Then, like a mirage, it disappears, but it always leaves me shaken. The library doesn't feel quite the same anymore. Its corridors bear an unspoken threat, an easy hush that saturates the air. I try to focus on the positives, the historical significance of the place, the invaluable texts I get to handle, but the memory of that pale hand is never far behind. It's become a silent warning, a reminder that some corners of the library harbor secrets best left undisturbed. I still volunteer there, though I avoid working the late shift as much as possible. When I do, I stay on the ground floor with the lights on, telling myself I'm just being efficient. In truth, I'm afraid of what I might see or imagine. If I wander upstairs alone sometimes, when the building is at its quietest, I catch an echo of that eerie scraping sound, like distant nails on wood every time my pulse spikes, and I fight the urge to run outside into the safety of the streetlights. There's no grand resolution, no final confrontation that banished whatever presence resides on that third floor. I haven't found any rational explanation, no historical footnote that might clarify the nature of what haunts this place. Yet I've come to accept that some mysteries remain unsolved. Lingering in the peripheral darkness, the library stands as an edifice of history and knowledge, but it also houses shadows of the unknown, and those shadows feel alive. Though I continue my duties, I know I'll never fully conquer. The dread that seeps through the walls of that old building whenever I'm in there. After dusk, a chill clutches my heart. I sense the library's silent vigilance, as though it is waiting for me to let my guard down. I haven't gone back to the third floor by myself. If a task requires it, I make sure someone else is around, even if it's just the guard downstairs, because that memory remains a pale hand on the railing, a creeping chill up my spine, and I can't shake the feeling that if I ever see it again, it might not disappear so quickly, and that possibility terrifies me more than any nightmare I've ever had. I first sensed something was wrong the moment I stepped into that building after sunset. The corridors had a way of swallowing every echo, turning ordinary footsteps into dull thuds that vanished all too quickly, leaving behind a suffocating quiet. The overhead lights flickered weakly, throwing elongated shadows against the walls as if hungry to devour the last traces of human comfort. I've always hated how deserted our commercial building becomes at night, like an abandoned monument that no one bothers to visit. But at least before that particular night, it never truly terrified me. It merely unsettled me like a stranger. stare from across a dark street now. Whenever I recall the events that unfolded, I feel my heart pound faster and my throat tighten as if the memory itself is physically grabbing hold of me. My shift rarely extended so late, but that night I had no choice. I was finishing up some paperwork, and by the time I glanced at the clock, it was well past the normal closing hour. The cleaning staff had already come and gone, and I could have sworn I was the only person left on the entire floor. The silence grew so thick that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning system overhead. It reminded me of a raspy breath like some slumbering beast waiting to wake. At any moment, I wanted nothing more than to pack my things and rush to the safety of my car, but I had to deal with one last chore, taking the trash down to the basement level via the service elevator. It was a small task, something I had done hundreds of times before during normal hours on that evening. Though it felt like a trial I wanted to avoid at all costs. I pushed the trash bin down the hall, trying to ignore the heavy shadows flickering along the corridor. The wheels squeaked loudly, echoing with each rotation. It set my nerves on edge. A part of me scolded my own imagination for running wild. It's just a building, it's just night. I told myself, yet I couldn't shrug off. The sensation that I was being watched. My skin prickled at the nape of my neck and my palms grew clammy around the handle of the bin. Looking back, I can't recall a single specific reason for feeling so paranoid, only that everything felt off. I reached the service elevator, its metallic doors reflecting the pet light of the hallway in an unnerving distortion. I pressed the button and waited, my stomach twisting with each passing second. The elevator made a dull clank as it arrived, and the doors slowly slid open. I rolled the trash bin inside, then stepped in after it as the doors closed. The overhead light inside the elevator flickered briefly, casting the cramped interior in a jittery strobe. My heart thumped and a bead of sweat trickled down my temple. I reminded myself to breathe. No sooner had the doors sealed shut. Then I sensed I was not alone. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the same battered walls and the fluorescent light fighting to stay lit. But then out of the corner of my eye I picked up a shape. A figure standing in the far corner, tall enough that it seemed hunched to avoid brushing its head against the low ceiling. I froze, a jolt of panic charging through my veins like electricity. My breathing became shallow, and I felt the vibrations of my own racing heartbeat in my eardrums. The figure was not leaning forward nor moving, it just loomed in that corner. So silent it barely seemed real. Part of me wanted to spin around and confront it, but fear rooted my feet to the floor. Time seemed to slow. The elevator rumbled downward, and in that terror-fueled hush, I heard nothing but the mechanical groaning of the cables and my own ragged breaths. I forced myself to shift my gaze fully toward the corner. The shape was still there. Vague, dark, unnaturally tall. I couldn't make out facial features, only that silhouette. I could have sworn the air around it looked denser, like a pocket of darkness. That had somehow gained its own volition. My throat was so dry it felt scratchy when I swallowed. My back was cold with sweat, and I prayed silently for the elevator to reach the basement. It felt like a lifetime before the doors finally creaked open. The trash bin rattled as the elevator halted. Light from the hallway spilled into the cramped interior, and I exhaled shakily, feeling the tension in my legs when I dared to look back at the corner to see if the figure was still there. It was gone just like that. I found myself staring at an empty space. The corner looked harmless, just scuffed metal walls and a dingy floor. My mind reeled for a moment. I wondered if exhaustion had gotten the best of me, but I was shaking so badly that I struggled to. Steady my hands on the trash bin, I rolled it out, then left it near the service area. I remember standing in that hallway, the flickering fluorescent lights above me, chest heaving, and a dreadful sense that I just witnessed something that shouldn't exist. 1,000 rational explanations sprinted through my thoughts. Shadows, reflections, a hallucination caused by lack of sleep, yet none of them felt satisfactory. I rushed back upstairs using the main elevator. The contrast between the bright, relatively clean interior of the lobby-level elevator and the dingy service one struck me. It felt like I traveled between two worlds. By the time I returned to my desk, my shirt was damp with perspiration and I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that towering silhouette lurking behind me. The rest of the building was still mocking me with its emptiness. When I reached my office, I saved my files, powered down my computer, and forced myself to leave. The drive home was a blur of taut nerves and second guesses. I played music at a low volume, anything to distract myself from the crawling sensation that someone was watching me through the rearview mirror. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning, convinced that every creak in my apartment was the echo of footsteps the next morning. In the clear light of day, everything felt less nightmarish. I told myself that the incident had probably been a trick of the mind, maybe a reflection from a nearby reflective surface, or a leftover bag of cleaning supplies that my eyes had distorted into a silhouette still. The memory made my palms sweat. I went back to work determined to find some rational explanation and put my imagination to rest. My first stop was the building security office. The guard on duty was reading a newspaper. I asked as neutrally as possible if I could look at footage from the previous night. He seemed confused, but pulled up the relevant recording. We located the timestamp of when I had stepped into the service elevator on the screen. I saw myself pulling the trash bin, looking uneasy, glancing back and forth. But there was no one standing beside me, no elongated figure, no shape at all. I felt a sickening twist in my gut as I watched the footage. I saw myself flinch as if I'd caught sight of something. Then I watched myself freeze, turning slightly toward the corner yet on the screen. That space looked empty. I couldn't explain why, but watching that replay made my heart pound even harder than the moment I'd witnessed the figure. A cold pressure pressed against my chest, reminding me of how fragile my own sense of reality could be. The guard asked if I was okay, noticing that my face had grown pale, so I muttered that I was feeling a bit under the weather. He suggested I get some rest the entire time. I remained fixated on that tiny, pixelated screen, trying to rationalize the difference between my recollection and the recorded reality. I felt my composure slipping over the next few days. I tried to bury myself in work to avoid thinking about the incident, but the building itself didn't let me forget yet. Every time the sun began to set and the corridors grew dark, that familiar tension seized me. I became hyper-aware of every flicker of light, every flick of a shadow at the edge of my vision. My heart would race for no apparent reason, forcing me to stop and take deep, steady breaths. Once I swore I heard a low whisper while I passed the supply closet on the 12th floor, but when I pressed my ear to the door, there was only something silence. Another evening, I caught a brief reflection in a window, a tall shape gliding behind me. But when I spun around, the corridor was empty. My coworker in the cubicle next to mine noticed how jittery I was becoming. He asked if everything was all right with me, and if I needed any help. I told him somewhat truthfully that I'd been having trouble sleeping. He mentioned that maybe I was working too many late nights. I nodded, grateful that he didn't pry further, but inside I felt the dread growing. What if I really was losing my mind at night? My dreams became vivid, feverish nightmares. I would find myself trapped in that service elevator, the lights flickering overhead. Each time the doors opened, the hallway was darker than before. A shape impossibly tall would drift into the elevator like a shadow. Made solid, pressing closer and closer until I could feel a freezing presence brushing against my skin. I'd bolt awake gasping and coated in sweat. My pulse hammering. The next day I'd arrive at the office with blurry eyes and a roiling stomach, unable to shake the fear. I tried small, superstitious methods to fend off my paranoia. I kept a flashlight in my pocket, telling myself that if I could flood the corners with light, nothing could hide there. I avoided the service elevator when I could, though occasionally I had no choice but to use it for deliveries. Each time I felt my heart race and my throat constrict, but I never again saw the figure as clearly as that first encounter. I only sensed presences like cold spots in the air or shifts in the darkness. One Thursday evening, I had to work late again. A coworker was waiting for a ride, so I felt marginally safer that I wasn't alone on the entire floor. Eventually, he left, and I was once more the last person in that hollow structure. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The building seemed to sigh in response, and the lights flickered intermittently. I tried to concentrate on the task at hand, some digital reports that needed to be finished by the next morning, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing toward the corridor. Every so often, I imagined I saw a shape gliding past my peripheral vision, not directly visible, but present enough to make my muscles clench. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight. I realized I needed to drop off a small package at the mailroom, which unfortunately was accessible only via that same service elevator, or an incredibly long walk down 2 flights of stairs and through a poorly lit corridor. Against my better judgment, I chose the elevator, hoping it would be quick and painless. When I reached the service elevator doors, I paused, noticing they were slightly ajar. A faint light glowed inside, my palms grew slick with sweat, and I felt a chill ripple through my spine. The elevator wasn't moving, but it looked as though someone had pressed the button recently. I stood there for a moment, swallowing against the dryness in my mouth, trying to gather my courage. Then I forced myself to step inside. The overhead light was dimmer than usual, casting thick shadows across the corners. My breath caught as the door slid shut. I pressed the button for the basement. The elevator jerked, descended a few floors, and then stopped with a groan between levels. By the sound of it, my chest tightened as the fluorescent bulb above flickered in and out. Leaving me in near darkness, I pressed the emergency button repeatedly, but nothing happened. A claustrophobic panic rose within me, and I felt my vision dimming at the edges. That was when I saw it again. That tall, looming figure in the corner, motionless but unmistakably present. My lungs burned as I forgot how to breathe properly. I wanted to shout, but my voice stuck in my throat. The flickering light revealed only the vaguest outline, a black column of shadow I could feel, rather than see the intensity of whatever it was staring straight into me. My body started shaking uncontrollably, a cold sweat washing over me. The temperature felt as if it had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I pressed myself against the opposite corner, heart crashing against my ribcage. The elevator's mechanical hum had gone silent, leaving only the faint crackling of the faulty light fixture. My mind raced. Was this real? A hallucination? Was I losing my grip on reality all the while I felt that presence looming, almost blending with the darkness, yet more tangible than my own reflection? I closed my eyes, counting my breaths, trying to conjure any explanation that might calm me. But the terror was too absolute. Seconds ticked by like hours until, with a sudden jolt, the elevator came back to life and resumed its descent. The figure didn't disappear this time. I could still sense it right there, as if waiting. Every nerve in my body screamed to flee, but there was no escape until the doors opened. At last, they slid apart with a groan and weak light from the basement. Corridor illuminated the interior. I stumbled out, nearly falling to my knees when I found the courage to glance back. The shape was gone, trembling. I delivered the package to the mailroom. My mind felt fragmented, teetering between rationality and blind panic. I decided then and there that I couldn't keep this up. No job was worth losing my sanity over. I resolved to speak to management the next day, request a shift change, or possibly even quit if it came to that. But that night wasn't done with me yet. As I headed back toward the main lobby, I swore I heard footsteps echoing behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that matched my pace exactly. My heart hammered and the hair on my arm stood on end. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something towering over me, but the hallway was empty. My breath was ragged and I was bathed in cold sweat. The walls seemed to close in and the overhead lights flickered madly. I forced myself to keep walking each step, an exercise in sheer will. My mind was shouting at me to run when I finally burst out through the main doors onto the silent street. I let out a gasping sigh, my limbs trembling so badly I could hardly walk straight. The night air felt cold and surreal, but at least it was free from the oppressive aura. Inside the building, I got into my car with fumbling hands. The entire drive home, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified that I might see that tall silhouette in the back seat. Fortunately, it never appeared by the time I reached my apartment. I was drenched in sweat, and shaking my mind, replayed the elevator sequence over and over like a broken record. The following day, I spoke with management, explaining that I was experiencing severe anxiety and requesting a different schedule. They granted it, albeit with confusion, and I found myself working fewer hours after dark. Yet the knowledge that the building still existed, its darkened corridors, and silent elevator shafts waiting for night to fall, weighed on me. Even in the daytime, I felt a prickling paranoia when I had to walk past the service elevator. Sometimes I swore I caught a glimpse of that corner looking darker than normal, like it was harboring something. I've come to realize that I may never truly know what I saw, whether it was a product of my own sleep-deprived mind or something that defies explanation. The experience remains etched into my memory with unnerving clarity. The silhouette's presence felt so real that I can still recall the static-like tension in the air whenever it appeared. Whenever I find myself alone in a quiet hallway, even outside of work, I have to steel my nerves against the creeping dread that I'm being observed by something just beyond the edge of vision. On my last day in that position, as I was clearing out my desk, I mustered the courage to take one final ride down the service elevator. I told myself I wanted closure. I pressed the call button and the doors slid open with their usual dull chime. I stepped inside, half expecting the light to flicker, half expecting that looming figure to greet me. But the elevator stayed well lit, humming softly, descending all the way to the lobby without incident. I couldn't decide if I was relieved or unnerved. A part of me almost felt that the presence was simply choosing not to show itself this time, leaving me to question whether the events really happened or if my psyche had conjured them under stress. I left the building feeling unsteady, a knot of tension lodged in my chest even now after moving on to a different job. The memory lingers. The nighttime hush of that building still haunts my thoughts. Sometimes I dream of it, an endless labyrinth of vacant floors and flickering lights, with that towering shadow waiting for me in the corner of the elevator, watching, quietly refusing to let me forget. Even though I escaped it physically, the lingering doubt and fear have stayed with me. I suspect they always will. It's difficult to convey the power of an experience that defies reason. I've tried to tell myself that it was a waking nightmare, a trick of peripheral vision or an artifact of my exhausted brain. Yet there's a corner of my mind that insists what I saw was real, that no matter how many sunlit days pass, something in that building remains, something that emerges when the corridors fall silent and the clocks tick past midnight, something that doesn't register on security footage but stands just an inch away from your greatest dread, pulling the strings of your terror like a maestro of the unknown. I wish I could say it's all behind me, but the truth is, that moment in the service elevator changed how I see deserted hallways, flickering lights, and yes, even my own reflection. I feel uneasy with the idea that we can't always trust the evidence of our eyes or the recording of a camera. Sometimes what we see and what we don't are two halves of a horrifying secret, and sometimes that secret is tall, silent, and waiting in the shadows for your moment of weakness. Even though no physical harm came to me, I can't help but feel that the scars left on my psyche might never fully heal. The building still stands and night still falls, and I know somewhere behind those vacant corridors and dark corners the presence lingers, unseen but never truly gone. I arrived at the family's rural property with a weariness that felt almost tangible. The long drive over winding roads had left my arms tense from gripping the steering wheel for hours, and I was in dire need of uninterrupted rest. Yet from the moment I stepped onto the uneven wooden porch, something felt amiss. The wind was still, the air almost thick, and the sun, though bright, did not seem to warm my skin. I remember stepping into the house, dropping my bag by the door, and sensing a certain hollow in the silence. It was as if the place exhaled stale air, greeting me with an uneasy calm. This was supposed to be a sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos of the city and the stress that had been gnawing at my mind. Instead, the atmosphere seemed to pulse with anticipation, like it was waiting for something I had no name for. I tried to dismiss my unease as mere exhaustion. My family's farmhouse, tucked away at the edge of a quiet stretch of land, had always been a bit isolated, and I told myself that isolation can sometimes feel eerie if you are alone after settling in. I wandered through the familiar rooms, noticing how age had worn the wooden floors and stained the curtains. The thick walls appeared to trap the light in strange ways, casting odd shadows that seemed to move. As I passed, the smell of old timber dusty shelves and distant memories lingered in the corridors, a faint reminder of the generations before me who had called this place home. The bedroom assigned to me was small and sparsely furnished, just a narrow bed, an old chest of drawers, and a full-length mirror leaning in the corner. The mirror's wooden frame was intricately carved with swirling patterns, probably hand-hung decades ago. It gave off a dark gloss as though it had been polished countless times, yet never lost its antique dullness. Something about that frame caught my attention immediately. Maybe it was the way the carving seemed to converge at the top, forming a vaguely unsettling shape like a face without features. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. My muscles ached, and all I wanted was to lie down, close my eyes, and drift into oblivion. That first night passed quietly enough, though I woke once or twice heart-thumping for reasons I couldn't pinpoint. I recall a momentary sense of vertigo when I glanced at the corner where the mirror stood. It reflected moonlight in a distorted silhouette so faint, I wasn't sure if it was actually there or just a trick of my exhausted mind. The room felt colder than it should, prompting me to pull the covers up to my chin and try to breathe calmly. Eventually, I slipped back into a restless sleep, telling myself I was simply on edge from the change in environment. The second day was meant to be a chance to relax, so I spent most of the morning walking around the property. The field seemed serene, dotted with small clusters of wildflowers and overgrown grass that swayed in a breeze I could barely feel. Every so often I would hear the distant crack of a branch or a faint rustle among the shrubs. Each time I glanced around, I saw nothing out of place, yet a prickle of anxiety lingered at the back of my neck as I made my way back to the house. The sky began to darken with thick clouds, and the air became strangely still again. That stillness weighed on me like a silent warning. After a simple dinner, I tried to keep my mind occupied by reading an old book I found on the shelf, but my attention kept drifting to the corridor beyond the living room. It was dimly lit by a single lamp, and the shadows seemed to stretch impossibly long, forming shapes that tugged at the corners of my vision. I thought I heard a soft shuffle of footsteps along the hallway, but reasoned it away as the old house settling. I decided it was best to head to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would banish the tension coiling in my chest. I slipped under the covers, letting the mattress creak beneath my weight. The rain started to fall gently at first, then intensified, tapping against the window in a steady rhythm. My eyelids grew heavy just as I began to drift off. A soft sound, like a sigh, reached my ears. I opened my eyes, my heart thawing in response. The sound was so faint I wondered if I had imagined it, but it left me alert. Every nerve on edge, I strained my hearing for a moment, but the only thing I registered was the persistent drumming of the rain. Slowly, I allowed myself to relax, sinking once more into that half-conscious state between waking and dreaming. Sometime in the dead of night, I came awake with a sudden gasp. My breathing was shallow, chest tight, with unprovoked panic. It felt as if I had jolted out of a nightmare. Though I couldn't remember any details, my gaze darted around the dark room until it fell on the mirror in the corner. The surface seemed hazy, like it was covered in a thin film of breath. I found it odd because the house wasn't especially humid, and the temperature wasn't significantly cold or warm to cause condensation. My gut twisted. Something about that slight fogging made me feel as though someone else had been standing there exhaling onto the glass. I got up, my pulse hammering in my ears. Each step I took toward that mirror made the boards beneath my feet creak ominously. My throat went dry as I inched closer in the darkness. I could see my pale face reflected back at me. My eyes looked unnaturally wide, rimmed with shadows from poor sleep. Then, for the briefest flicker of an instant, I caught a glimpse of something else, another outline, a facehook hovering beside mine. My heart slammed in my chest, and I staggered back nearly, tripping over my own feet when I dared to look again. All I saw was my own terrified expression. The haze on the mirror was still there, but it offered no sign of that second face. I stood there trembling, adrenaline surging through my veins. My stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Eventually, I forced myself to return to bed. Sleep was a lost cause, but I lay down out of sheer exhaustion, heart pounding and skin clammy. I must have drifted off sometime near dawn because the next thing I recall is the faint light of morning seeping through the curtains at breakfast. I felt disoriented and on edge. My hands shook slightly as I poured coffee, and my appetite was non-existent. The oddness of the night weighed on me, but I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy by sticking to a routine. I cleared the table, walked outside to check the property line, and did my best to ignore the persistent feeling that I was being watched. In the periphery of my vision, I sometimes thought I saw a dark silhouette standing by the side of the house, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing, just an empty stretch of grass and a few leaning trees. The third night arrived with a suffocating heaviness. It was as though the air itself had thickened, making it difficult to breathe. My nerves were raw and my entire body felt tense. I settled into bed, leaving the lamp on this time, desperate to dispel some of the looming shadows. The mirror's reflection cast a distorted glow along the walls, creating wavering shapes. I tried to read for a bit, but every small noise, a creak of the floor, the rustle of the wind outside made me jump. Eventually, I turned off the lamp, hoping darkness might bring relief. Sleep was elusive. My mind conjured images of that mirror, remembering how the glass had looked clouded the night before, and how just for an instant I thought I saw another face. A chill crawled up my spine as I imagined that unknown presence hovering just beyond my line of sight. My heart rate surged every time I thought I heard a subtle shift in the room, like fabric brushing against wood or a quiet shuffle across the floor. Midway through the night, I felt compelled to check the mirror again. I didn't even fully understand why. Perhaps a morbid curiosity or a need to confirm that it was still just a normal piece of furniture. Forcing myself to get up, I walked toward it. My breath felt hot and ragged in my throat, and I could feel the thumping of my pulse in my wrists. The closer I got, the more a sense of dread swelled within me. My skin prickled with goosebumps and my legs felt weak standing before the mirror. I saw my reflection cast in faint moonlight. My cheeks looked hollow eyes. Sunken from lack of rest, the carved frame seemed to loom around me, almost pulsing in the dark. I leaned in cautiously, half expecting to see that phantom face again. But the glass was clear this time, showing only my own haunted features. Just when I was about to step back, I heard that faint sigh again. Only this time it felt like it was right behind me. My throat went tight, and I snapped around, certain I would see someone in the shadows. There was nobody. I walked back to the bed with shaky legs, every muscle in my body tensed, as if ready to bolt sleep. Never fully came after that. I lay there, eyes squeezed shut, forcing myself to keep breathing. The darkness felt alive with watchful eyes, and I was certain something lurked just outside my vision. My heart pounded so violently that my chest hurt. By morning, I resolved to investigate the mirror's origins. There had to be some explanation, perhaps a family myth or a rumor about the house that I'd never heard before. I looked through the dusty shelves, flipping through old notes and letters. It was mostly mundane records about harvests, livestock repairs. Nothing that hinted at anything supernatural. Yet as I rummaged through the drawers, I found a small scrap of paper containing a brief mention of an unsettling presence in the upstairs mirror. The handwriting was old and faded, and it offered no details. I stared at the words, my heart lurching with recognition. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had felt something unnatural about this object all day. The sense of being watched dogged me. I kept seeing shapes just out of my field of vision. A flicker of movement near the staircase. A suggestion of a figure peering through a window. Whenever I turned, no one was there. My paranoia grew with each passage hour, culminating in a near constant tension in my shoulders. Even the air smelled wrong, damp and sour like stagnant water. Night fell once more, and I dreaded returning to that room. My mouth felt as dry as if I had swallowed chalk, and my palms were slick with sweat. Nonetheless, I forced myself to lie down, hoping the ordeal would somehow subside. The hours stretched on, and I alternated between drowsy half-sleep and jolts of sheer panic. At some point, I became aware of a raspy sound like labored breathing. Just a few feet away, my eyes flew open and I stared at the blackness, scarcely daring to move. My arms felt paralyzed, my lungs refusing to draw air naturally. The noise persisted, filling the silence with a slow, agonizing rhythm. I mustered the courage to flick on the lamp. The sound stopped instantly, as if someone had plugged a leak in a pressurized chamber. Adrenaline pounded in my veins, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced toward the mirror. It was angled in such a way that from the bed I could see part of the room reflected, including the door. This time I saw a subtle blur in the reflection, like a smear of darkness that did not match any object in the room. My heart hammered so loudly that my ears rang and my skin broke out in goosebumps again. I realized the mirror was showing some presence. I couldn't identify. It wasn't a clear shape, but a faint distortion similar to heat waves. Rising off asphalt in summer, only it was darker, colder. I kept staring, my eyes watering from the intensity of my own fear. Then the shape seemed to move. It slid across the glass as though pacing back and forth. The breath caught in my throat. I felt utterly helpless in that moment, pinned by my own terror. My mind raced with questions. Was I hallucinating? Was something truly in this house, or was the mirror itself cursed, desperate, and terrified? I leapt from the bed and grabbed a blanket without looking directly at the mirror. I hurled the blanket over it. Covering that polished surface, my heart was pounding so forcefully it hurt, and I took several gulping breaths just to keep from fainting. The sense of dread in the room was overwhelming, but at least I could no longer see that shifting darkness in the reflection. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in a corner of the bed covers pulled up around me. My mind cycled through every possible explanation: sleep deprivation, stress, a failing mental state, but a deeper part of me was convinced that something truly horrifying had latched onto that mirror, or had always been there, lurking behind the veneer of its aged wood and cloudy glass. Morning could not come soon enough. The moment dawnlight infiltrated the thin curtains, I packed my things in a flurry, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my belongings. The entire house felt alive with tension, as though it was watching me scramble. My heart wouldn't settle, pounding furiously while I stuffed clothes into my bag. I wanted nothing more than to leave that place, to put as much distance between me and that mirror as humanly possible. I left the blanket draped over the mirror. I couldn't bring myself to look at it one last time. The thought of seeing that presence, or worse, seeing an actual face, made my chest tighten as I closed the bedroom door behind me. I felt a subtle pressure in the air, almost like a hand pressed against my back, ushering me out. My fear spiked again, but I forced myself to stay composed, reminding myself that if I panicked too much, I might never escape once. Outside, I could breathe a little more freely, though I noticed the sky was a dull gray, oppressive clouds looming overhead. I got into my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. My pulse thundered as I drove away, half expecting to glance in the rearview mirror and spot something sitting in the back seat. That entire drive felt surreal. My mind still struggling to reconcile the events of the past days with any kind of rational explanation. Even now, as I reflect on the experience, my pulse quickens. I can't quite convince myself it was all in my head when I think about that mirror and the face I almost saw. I feel a cold sweat break out on my skin sometimes in the dead of night. I jolt awake, convinced I hear that faint sigh drifting across the room, or see a haze forming on a reflective surface. In those moments, I remind myself that I left that haunted place behind, that I escaped whatever was lurking in that old mirror. But there's a part of me that can't help wondering if it followed me, slipping out through the corner of my eye, finding its way into my reflections. Wherever I go, the unease it left in my mind has become a constant companion, a lingering sense of dread that flares up whenever a dark corner or a polished window catches my gaze. Sometimes late at night, I catch myself holding my breath, listening for that quiet sigh, waiting for the next sign that I'm not alone. And every time I pass by a mirror, I catch myself pausing, fearing that if I look too closely, I might find something staring back that isn't me. A biting wind lashed the side of our car, as if nature itself tried to warn us away from the road. That night, the headlights carved weak tunnels through the thick darkness, revealing little but swirls of dust and endless stretches of scraggly weeds. There was no moon to comfort us, only a mass of storm clouds closing in, swallowing the sky and leaving me with an unshakable sense that we were driving into something we should never witness. My hands felt clammy on the steering wheel. My heart pounded so violently that each beat seemed to echo within the silent interior. Even my friend, who usually possessed an unflappable excitement for roadside adventures, had grown unusually quiet. It was the kind of night when the world seemed hollow, and yet everything was charged with the promise of menace. I recall that we had set out earlier that day with bright intentions. We wanted a collection of off-the-beaten-path photographs, something to impress other enthusiasts who swore by tourist traps we'd planned meticulously, layering up memory cards and external batteries, convinced that our spontaneous route along old unmarked back roads would yield stunning shots of abandoned barns and rolling fields. By the time the sun sank behind the hills, leaving the landscape dull gray, I already felt a sense of creeping unease. We were deep in the middle of nowhere, with the next town pinned on a map that looked more theoretical than actual. My friend had said we'd find a small motel if we kept going north, so I reluctantly agreed to continue, but as we turned onto a pitted dirt road around 10 at night, a hollow feeling in the pit of my stomach told me we were making a mistake. The only light came from our high beams, feeble and flickering, illuminating twisted fences and occasional clumps of trees that leaned across the road like conspirators. The notion that we might see a house or another car seemed increasingly far-fetched. The place was eerily deserted. Then I saw him, a lone figure walking on the shoulder, no jacket, no visible bag, arms hanging at his sides. At first, I nearly convinced myself I was hallucinating. No one would be out there in the freezing wind with darkness engulfing all directions. But there he was. I slowed down reflexively, uncertain if he needed help, and that was when he lifted one hand in a stiff motion, signaling for us to stop. His face, illuminated by our headlights, was painfully neutral. His eyes held no warmth or desperation, only a stillness that set my nerves ablaze. I could not explain why, but something in that gaze made me feel as if I were an intruder. My friend murmured that we should offer him a ride, but I found myself shaking my head. Every instinct told me to keep going. I gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement to the stranger, but pressed on the accelerator. I saw his expression remained unchanging through the side mirror, and the reflection of his eyes never wavered. Even as the car picked up speed, he stood there motionless, staring after us for the next 30 minutes. The road seemed endless and suffocating. My friend asked repeatedly whether we had made the right choice, but I barely managed to answer. Instead, I felt my skin prickle with waves of cold sweat. The hair on the back of my neck stayed stiff, as if expecting an invisible hand to clamp down at any moment. When we finally reached a dimly lit gas station, relief washed over me in trembling currents. The sight of fluorescent lights, the distant hum of a soda machine, and the ordinary clutter of parked vehicles felt like a lifeline to sanity. I stepped out, legs shaky, noticing the battered sign listing outlandish gas prices. I filled the tank in silence. In the background, my friend was telling me we should at least mention the man to the station attendant. I only nodded absent-mindedly, too unsettled to form coherent words. Inside, the station attendant seemed disinterested, responding with non-committal shrugs when my friend recounted that we'd seen a man on the roadside. He casually mentioned that drifters sometimes pass through, though not typically this late. Yet there was something in the attendant's voice, an edge of forced calm that only magnified my apprehension. Perhaps he had encountered something similar before and was making every effort not to spook us further. When my friend asked if there was a more direct route ahead, the attendant simply suggested staying on the main gravel road for another hour. If we kept going, we would eventually reach our intended motel. My pulse throbbed in my ears as we stepped back outside, uncertain but unwilling to linger in a gas station that felt haunted by unspoken stories. We pulled out onto the road again, hoping that 30 more miles of driving would pass uneventfully. My eyes strained against the darkness. The tension in my chest was almost unbearable. I kept checking the rearview mirror as if expecting to see that figure trailing behind us impossibly keeping pace. The wind picked up, rattling the car windows. I felt the wheel shutter under my hands as if the entire world wanted to unhinge and plunge us into the depths of some nightmare. My friend remained quiet occasionally, pointing out a battered billboard or a turnoff sign, but neither of us truly believed we'd see anything normal again. Then around midnight, we reached the same stretch of road where we had first seen the man. My heart hammered so violently I could feel my pulse throbbing at my temples. Sure enough, there he stood this time in the middle of the lane directly in our path. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car fishtailing slightly on the gravel. The man's posture was rigid, hands by his sides, that same eerie stillness in his eyes. I became hyper-aware of every tiny detail, my breath rattling in short bursts, sweat trickling down my back, the dryness coating my mouth. My friend whispered that we should roll down a window and ask him what he needed, but I refused. My voice trembling as I insisted we turn around. I made a sharp U-turn tires, kicking up a cloud of dust that spiraled around the man in the swirling haze. I thought I saw him smirk, though the taillights only highlighted his silhouette. Fear expanded in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I took an alternative route longer, more potholes, less signage, anything to get away from that figure. A sense of panic pulsed through me with every mile I put between us and him. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following us, not by normal means, but by something beyond my understanding. I felt eyes on me whenever we passed a grove of trees or a partially collapsed barn. Every shape along the roadside looked like a human outline, and every gust of wind sounded like a labored breath. My friend tried to calm me, pointing out that the man couldn't possibly move that fast. Even if he had a hidden vehicle, there was no road that led him to appear twice in those random spots without us seeing it. I nodded silently, but dread sank deeper into my bones. My hands were slick on the steering wheel and my arms ached from gripping it too tightly. The darkness seemed alive, pressing against the windows, and the interior of the car felt claustrophobic under the weight of the unknown. When we finally re-emerged onto a more open stretch of road, I risked a glance into the rearview mirror. The reflection revealed nothing but darkness, and yet I felt certain that if I stared long enough I would see him there. Stepping out of the blackness, we drove for hours, never finding the motel we had been promised. Instead, we passed boarded-up houses with broken windows and sagging roofs, their decaying structures looming out of the darkness like silent sentinels. There were no lights in any windows, no signs of life, only the relentless hush of the wind. Every so often, I swore I heard a low thud under the car, like a muffled footstep on the trunk, but each time I pulled over to check there was nothing. The engine purred, the road stretched ahead, and the emptiness around us felt like it would swallow us at any moment. A creeping paranoia began to gnaw at my mind. I questioned whether I had really seen the man twice or if the night was playing tricks on my exhausted senses. My friend tried to reassure me, suggesting that maybe we had simply passed two different hitchhikers who wore similarly dark clothes, but I knew it was the same man with the same blank expression and unnaturally intense stare. I couldn't articulate how I knew, but it seemed as though his image had branded itself onto my subconscious so that I would recognize him. No matter how quickly we drove by, each time I recalled his vacant face, my heart began pounding new, and a wave of goosebumps spread over my arms. We eventually decided to pull over at a clearing next to a small cluster of trees, purely because my body trembled with exhaustion. Sleep seemed impossible, but resting for a moment felt necessary. I turned off the engine, and the silence that fell was like a vacuum. I could hear my pulse in my ears and the faint sound of my friend's uneasy breathing. The night's cold wrapped around us like an unwelcome embrace. I shut my eyes for a moment, only to sense movement in the corner of my vision. I snapped them open, scanning the tree line. My breath caught in my throat when I noticed a faint shape between the trunks, tall and motionless. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt certain it was him watching. We quickly got back on the road, no longer interested in rest, and tried in vain to lose ourselves in the labyrinth of backcountry lanes. Soon the road's condition worsened, forcing me to drive slowly around massive potholes and jagged rocks. Each jolt of the car sent a fresh spike of adrenaline coursing through me. I imagined the man stepping onto the road around every bend or materializing in the back seat. When I glanced away, my friend stopped making conversation altogether, perhaps feeling my terror bleeding into his own psyche. The atmosphere grew stifling. Each passing hour felt more surreal, as if we had entered some half-forgotten realm where time and distance no longer followed any logical rules. The final straw came when my headlights illuminated a figure on the horizon standing perfectly still in the middle of the lane. Yet again, it was impossible, but I knew it was him. Before my mind could form the thought, my body reacted on pure instinct. I swerved violently, nearly driving into a ditch. My friend shouted something incomprehensible. I gritted my teeth, spun the wheel, and somehow regained control of the car. By the time we straightened out, the road ahead was empty. No sign of the man. My heart hammered as if trying to break out of my chest. A slick film of sweat covered my forehead, and my lungs ached with each panicked breath. I pressed the accelerator, ignoring the violent bumps as I sped away from that spot hours later, though it might have been mere minutes as my sense of time was utterly warped. We saw a timid glow in the distance. It turned out to be a pair of old floodlights, illuminating a rickety metal sign. It marked the edge of a small town we'd never heard of, but at that moment it felt like a divine beacon. We pulled into the single motel near the sign, and I practically stumbled out of the car, legs numb and heart still drumming. My friend muttered that he didn't care what the room looked like. We just needed a roof over our heads, a locked door, and a chance to breathe. The lobby was empty, with a note that said the key was under the mat. If we arrived late, we found it stumbled to a musty-smelling room and bolted the door behind us that night. I couldn't sleep every time my eyes drifted closed. I felt an invisible presence. Just beyond the window, my heart wouldn't slow its gallop. Each rustle of wind made me tense, half convinced the door handle was about to turn. At some point, I sank into a restless doze filled with swirling images of headlights, empty roads, and that piercing stare. When morning finally arrived, the grim pale light gave me no comfort. I felt as though I had escaped a labyrinth of nightmares, but I could not shake the certainty that something had followed me out. We left that town as soon as we could, opting for a more populated route back to civilization. Yet even in daylight, every roadside figure triggered a jolt of panic, and my chest constricted until I was certain it wasn't him. I've replayed those events countless times since I've wondered whether I hallucinated the entire thing, or if we inadvertently crossed paths with something not entirely human. Sometimes in the dead of night, I recall the way his eyes looked under the headlights, cold, unblinking, as if dissecting my soul with a single glance. To this day, I still feel unsettled whenever I drive alone at night. The memory of that silent man at the edge of the road persists, a ghostly reminder of the boundaries we crossed in our quest for hidden places. I often ask myself what would have happened if I'd stopped the car or if I hadn't seen him in time. But perhaps the most terrifying question is how he managed to appear again and again, defying the logic of time and distance. I've tried to rationalize it, suggesting he might have had some vehicle stashed away, or that he was simply a drifter with uncanny luck. Yet deep down, I sense an answer far more disturbing even now. I sometimes dream that I'm driving down a deserted road at midnight, the air thick with dread, the darkness absolute in the dream. I see the man again standing in the middle of the lane, impossibly close to my headlights as I press the brake pedal. He turns his head and stares straight into my eyes, wordlessly demanding something I cannot give. I always wake with a racing heart drenched in sweat, uncertain whether I've just escaped a dream or momentarily glimpsed another reality, and I suspect that if I ever venture back to those forsaken roads, I might find him waiting. Eternal, silent, and inescapable. The thought still sends a cold shiver through my entire body, a reminder that not all roads lead to places we're meant to go. Sometimes the darkest paths are better left unexplored. From the moment I turned off the main highway onto that lonely dirt road, I sensed something was wrong. It was an oppressive kind of silence that seemed to settle around me, as if the breeze and the birds conspired to hush themselves. In my presence, my headlights traced the contours of leaning trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, urging me to turn back, but I was determined to find this hidden stretch of river that I had been told was perfect for fishing. Remote, calm, and rarely visited, I had planned this weekend to clear my head to be far from the noise of the city, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing somewhere I didn't quite belong. My gut told me that I was heading toward an experience I would rather not have. Even before I arrived at the campsite, by the time I finally parked, dusk was already thick around me. The orange glow on the horizon had receded into a faint purple haze, leaving the landscape coated in a veil of shadows. Standing by the trunk of my car, I realized just how isolated I was. There were no other vehicles, no signposts, no lights from distant cabins or houses, only an endless expanse of trees and brush, punctuated by the faint gurgle of flowing water somewhere beyond. I felt a momentary spike of unease, but I forced myself to ignore it. I told myself I was just being overly cautious, that this was precisely the solitude I had longed for. I trudged down a narrow trail leading to the riverbank, gear clinking with each step, the dusty ground crunching underfoot. Eventually, I found the spot I had been told about, a gentle bend in the river where the current slowed enough to create a shallow pool. The water glistened under the last remnants of twilight, looking deceptively calm. Perfect for casting a fishing line, I thought I set up my tent close to the river's curve, driving the stakes into the hard ground with deliberate, forceful blows as though asserting my presence might ward off any misgivings. My breath was steady, but my heart thumped a little louder than usual. I tried to quell my own nerves by focusing on the mundane tasks of securing the tent, unrolling my sleeping bag, and prepping a small area for a campfire. When night finally fell, it descended completely. The moon was a thin crescent, giving me only the barest sliver of light. My fire struggled against the inky darkness, spitting and crackling, but never truly illuminating the full expanse around me. Every few minutes, I would hear a rustling in the nearby brush or the plop of a fish somewhere downstream, and I'd feel the hairs on my neck bristle. I reminded myself that all forests come alive at night. Small animals, scurry insects, buzz branches sway. These were normal sounds, yet each subtle noise was enough to send a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my body. The sensation of being watched was already creeping in, but I tried to suppress it. I sat on a folding chair near the fire, my fishing rod set aside for the early morning hours. The temperature dropped faster than I expected, and a cool wind carried the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves as I warmed my hands near the flickering flames. I caught a glimpse of movement across the river, a dark shape taller than any bush shifting among the trees on the opposite bank. At first I strained to see if it might be some animal, maybe a deer or a lost hiker, but there was something unnatural in the way it moved, slow and deliberate, as if it was examining me. My pulse quickened and my mind raced through a jumble of possibilities. Whatever it was, it made no sound, just footsteps, heavy and resonant, snapping twigs underfoot. I felt a cold spike of fear carve a path through my gut. I wanted to call out to ask who it was and whether they needed help, but the rational part of me resisted the presence of another person here. This late, without any kind of flashlight or camping gear, seemed off. My adrenaline spiked even more. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to give a short shout. Something like, "Is anyone there?" The only response was silence, a suffocating, almost tangible silence. No birds, no breeze rustling the leaves, nothing. Despite the warmth of the fire, my skin broke out in goosebumps. Anxiety slithered up my spine, and I kept telling myself that maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks in the darkness. A few minutes later, the shape shifted again, as if it had heard something or decided to move. I saw the figure duck behind a cluster of shrubs. My eyes darted around trying to track its trajectory. Then I heard another series of branches snapping from somewhere behind me on my side of the river. My chest tightened and I shot up from my chair, heart hammering so violently I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. A wave of dizziness overtook me and I had to take a few steps to steady myself. The idea that someone or something might be encircling me, approaching from the rear, felt deeply wrong. That primal instinctive alarm I had ignored earlier was now screaming at me to leave my mind churned with possibilities. Perhaps it was a trespasser, a stranger living off the grid, or an over-inquisitive hunter, but there was an odd stillness between each noise, as though the forest itself was complicit in hiding this unseen presence. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. Each exhalation trembled in my throat and my hands felt clammy. My chest felt tight and the nighttime chill seeped into my bones. No matter how close I stood to the fire, time stretched on and the footsteps eventually receded, but I could sense I was no longer alone. I was certain something was waiting just beyond the circle of light thrown by my campfire. My muscles tensed with every stray crack of a branch or shift in the undergrowth. At one point, I tried to focus on the small tasks again, rearranging some of my gear, sipping water from my canteen, checking the dryness of my spare clothes just to distract myself. Yet my ears never stopped straining for the slightest sign of movement, my skin prickling at the possibility of a hidden observer. When I finally retreated into my tent, I felt anything but safe. I zipped the entrance closed, but that flimsy barrier offered little solace. My flashlight flickered across the fabric walls, revealing ominous shapes formed by tree shadows each time the wind gusted. It produced a faint scraping along the tent, making me jolt. My heart rate refused to settle, and I lay there with my eyes wide open, ears attuned to every whisper of the night in the darkness. My imagination began to spiral, conjuring images of silent figures crouched just outside, waiting for me to drift off. I tried to calm my mind by counting my breaths, reminding myself that I was simply spooking myself in an unfamiliar place, but logic felt feeble against the suffocating fear that clenched my entire body. Eventually, I sank into a restless sleep, more from sheer exhaustion than from any real sense of security. I awoke in the gray pre-dawn light, feeling groggy and disoriented. My back ached from the uneven ground, and my throat was parched for a moment. I convinced myself that the unsettling events of the previous night had been exaggerated by fatigue. As I stepped outside, the river drifted lazily by and a light fog hovered over the surface. Birds chirped cautiously in the distance, and the forest seemed almost peaceful. I wanted to believe that the sense of dread had been just my nerves. I gathered my fishing rod, positioned myself near the shallow pool, and cast my line. The anticipation of a catch was a small comfort. I tried to immerse myself in that routine, letting the rhythm of reeling in and casting out lull me into a temporary calm. Yet every now and then I'd notice something off, footprints in the damp soil oil along the bank that certainly weren't mine, or bent branches overhead that seemed too high for me to have caused. Every unexpected detail tugged at my renewed anxiety. Around noon, I decided to move around a bit, scouting a different part of the river's bend. As I hiked through the patchy undergrowth, I found signs that someone had passed through: recently broken twigs, fresh imprints in the mud, even a tuft of fabric stuck on a branch. The color of the fabric was a dark, muddy shade, something that could easily blend into the shadows. Immediately, I felt that spike of unease return. There was no rational reason for anyone else to be out there without a visible campsite or vehicle nearby. By late afternoon, a bank of ominous clouds had rolled in, turning the sky a sickly gray. Thunder growled in the distance. The forest grew dim, shadows stretching across the ground like long fingers. My plan was to stay another night and continue fishing the next morning, but that creeping sense of being stalked had grown too powerful to dismiss. My every instinct told me to leave before nightfall trapped me again. The problem was that curiosity and stubbornness fought to keep me from running off. I almost wanted to prove to myself that I could endure a single night alone by the river without succumbing to irrational fear. After all, I had seen no direct threat, just unsettling signs and fleeting shadows. That second night, I tried to set up a larger fire, gathering extra wood in hopes it would burn longer and brighter. A gusty wind made the flames dance unpredictably, casting wild shapes across the trees. The shadows twisted and elongated in ways that looked almost animate. My pulse quickened each time a flicker of light suggested a silhouette lurking at the edge of the woods. Occasionally, I heard something: a footstep, a broken branch, or maybe just the wind, but it always seemed too measured, too intentional to be random. Forest noise, it was like the presence I'd felt the night before was still there, watching me, assessing me. The night dragged on my stomach, churned with each minute that passed. My breathing felt labored as if the air were heavier than usual. Pressing down on my chest at one point, I stood brandishing the largest stick I could find. Feeling foolish but too scared to be embarrassed, I even tried to speak aloud, loud in a halting, quivering tone, insisting that whoever was out there show themselves or leave me alone. My voice sounded small and desperate, swallowed up by the surrounding darkness in the moments after my outburst. The forest seemed to hold its breath. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. Then faintly I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees to my left. It was a shape hunched but tall, swaying slightly. My eyes strained, but the darkness made it impossible to see features. My scalp prickled and my body broke into a cold sweat. I took a trembling step toward the shape my makeshift club gripped tightly, and I nearly gagged from the metallic taste of fear pooling in my mouth. The figure seemed to drift back into the gloom, leaving me gasping for air. The rest of that night became a haze of anxiety. I felt sure that at any moment something would lunge out of the darkness or the tent walls would collapse under some assault. Yet it never came. Instead, I was tormented by a deep, persistent paranoia. Every shift of the wind sounded like footfalls. Every crackle of the fire made me twitch. My thoughts spiraled into madness, and I questioned whether I was hallucinating or if something unearthly truly prowled the riverbank. My entire body trembled and my throat stayed desert dry. No matter how much water I sipped when dawn finally broke, it didn't bring relief. My nerves were shot. My eyes blurry from lack. Of real sleep, the fire had long since died out, leaving only a ring of ashes smudged into the dirt. Birds started their morning calls again, but I found no comfort in their routine. I realized I needed to leave no matter what my equipment was scattered around the campsite, and I hurried to pack it with shaky hands. I glanced over at the river, now a dull green under the early morning light, and I sensed a lingering presence just beyond the mist. It felt like the trees themselves were straining to watch me as I gathered my belongings during the frantic dismantling of my camp. I noticed something etched into the bark of a nearby tree, an odd symbol like interlocking spirals carved so deeply it exposed the pale wood beneath. I hadn't seen it before, and I had no clue who might have done it. An involuntary shudder coursed through me. It was one more sign that someone or something had been closer than I ever realized. During the night, I felt exposed and foolish for staying as long as I had. I practically sprinted back to my car, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that any second I would see that dark figure skulking through the trees behind me. My shoulders were knotted with tension, my shirt damp from cold sweat. My mind raced with jumbled thoughts, and my chest felt tight with unresolved dread. After what seemed like an eternity, I reached my vehicle, threw my gear in, and slammed the door. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and for a split second I thought I saw a movement in the side mirror. Just a flicker of black darting among the trees, my lungs seized. I couldn't bring myself to look more carefully. I floored the accelerator, tearing down that dusty road, not caring about potholes or the branches scratching the sides of my car as I merged back onto the main highway. The weight in my chest eased just enough for me to breathe more freely. Yet I still felt contaminated by the place I had just left, as though I brought back a piece of its darkness with me. I kept expecting to see some shape in my rearview mirror or notice footprints by my car door when I stopped for gas. The experience clung to me like a heavy fog refusing to dissipate. Even hours later, back in the familiarity of city streets, my mind couldn't let go of the notion that something had watched me out there and had followed me at least to the edge of the forest. I couldn't rationalize what I had seen or thought. I had seen my imagination might have filled in the gaps of a completely normal set of circumstances, or perhaps something truly strange resides in that isolated bend of the river. Something that defies common explanation. Even now, whenever I close my eyes, I still hear the crunch of leaves, still see a tall, shifting shadow in the corner of my vision, and still feel that laden fear coursing through my bloodstream. No matter how many times I tell myself it was just paranoia, a part of me remains unconvinced. I'm left with the unsettling knowledge that there are places where nature is indifferent. where isolation warps the mind and where something unnamed might be waiting to be encountered. And if you ever find yourself following a deserted trail to a secluded riverbend, remember sometimes you are not alone, even when you desperately want to be. I remember the stifling weight in the air before I even set foot inside that decrepit wooden shed. The night was moonless, and the entire farm seemed to be holding its breath as though afraid of what might happen next. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the dusty ground, and a sense of wrongness clung to the atmosphere like a stubborn stain. I felt it in the tingling on the back of my neck and in the sudden dryness of my throat, an unshakable impression that I was trespassing on something best left undisturbed. I had come to my uncle's farm to assist with harvesting. It was supposed to be straightforward, a couple of days of hard work in the fields, then restful evenings spent in the old ranch house, perhaps a few beers after sundown. I never imagined I'd be drawn to that condemned shed, the one my uncle always avoided, rarely spoke of after years of disuse. It stood at the edge of the property like a withered sentinel. The planks bowed and splintered from decades of neglect, and yet there was a peculiar magnetism about it. Perhaps it was the rotting timber or the stories the farmhands whispered whenever they passed by, or maybe it was just my own foolish curiosity. I couldn't stop replaying that first impression in my head. The door practically welded, shut by rust, the scent of moist earth lingering inside as though fresh soil had been scattered just hours before. Yet there was something else beneath the smell of dirt, a coppery undertone that tightened my stomach. Once the sun went down, I felt an undeniable urge to return. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that my imagination was acting up, or perhaps part of me was chasing the thrill of uncovering secrets best left buried on. That first night, I slipped away after dinner, ensuring nobody noticed my absence. My heart hammered in my chest before I even reached the shed's entrance. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow, as if my body was unconsciously bracing for confrontation. The door protested with a long, shrill screech. When I forced it open immediately, the smell of wet soil engulfed my senses again. More pungent in the darkness, the beam of my flashlight cut through clouds of dust, and for an instant it illuminated old tools strewn haphazard along the floor, rusted sickles, chipped shovels, battered rakes. Everything lay in a chaotic sprawl, yet among those decaying items I glimpsed suspiciously shiny metal pieces, the edges appearing recently sharpened as though someone had been there. Not too long ago, taking cautious steps forward, I felt my pulse throb in my ears. My palms grew clammy around the flashlight's handle the only sounds. At first were my own footsteps and the soft rasp of my clothes brushing against the doorframe. Then I heard movement. It was faint, but it reverberated in the cramped space like a muffled rustling. It reminded me of a large sack being dragged across the floor, or possibly heavy cloth brushing against a solid surface. My breath caught in my throat, pointing the flashlight toward the far corner. I saw only darkness where the light struggled to reach. Then scanning downward, I noticed fresh marks etched into the packed dirt floor. They resembled long, uneven scratches, some shallow, others deeper, as though something sharp had dug into the ground. A wave of cold fear rippled through me. My stomach clenched and a shiver rolled up my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a vagrant seeking shelter or a wild animal rummaging for a warm place. My uncle had warned me more than once that raccoons or stray dogs sometimes wandered into old structures, but something about those scratches didn't seem animalistic. The spacing between them felt too deliberate, as if whatever made them had an almost human sense of intention. I didn't dare linger to find out. I retreated, careful not to make any sudden noise, each floorboard squeaking in disapproval beneath my boots. Just as I neared the door, I heard a loud thud on the external wall of the shed. The vibration traveled through the wood and into my bones. My heart jolted and a violent surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. Convinced I wasn't alone, I hurried outside without looking back. Once I was out in the open, the night air seemed suffocating rather than refreshing. I stood there paralyzed for a moment. I felt eyes on me, though from where I couldn't tell, the darkness surrounding the shed felt thicker, as if it were wrapping itself around my body. Then from inside, I heard it again, that same dull thud sounding almost like an echo of my own heartbeat. It took all my willpower not to run screaming into the house. Instead, I forced myself to move. Slowly stepping away with as much composure as I could manage, every step felt heavier than the last, my legs trembling from the residual burst of fear. The next morning, I recounted my experience to my uncle in hushed, nervous phrases. He stared at me skeptically but agreed to come. Take a look when we went together, though. The daylight offered little comfort. The shed now looked pitifully dilapidated. The sun revealed the extent of the rot in its walls, the sagging roof, and the vines that had started to reclaim parts of the outer structure inside the tools that had appeared so menacing under my flashlight. Now seemed harmless. Corroded relics of times. Gone by the suspiciously sharp edges I had noticed the night before, didn't appear nearly as threatening. Everything looked ordinary in the mundane glare of noon. We found only the faint outlines of footprints and irregular scuff marks, which my uncle concluded might be from raccoons or some other scavenger. He seemed to believe I was merely spooked by the shadows. Still, I could tell he wasn't entirely at ease. I observed how he avoided stepping into the far corner, his eyes flickering there once or twice with a trace of unease. He didn't find anything conclusive, so he simply shrugged and remarked that the place was best left locked throughout the day. I tried to shake off the dread that clung to me. Harvesting corn under the relentless sun should have worn me out enough to sleep dreamlessly, but by the time darkness descended again, my mind was riddled with possibilities. I kept replaying the strange noises, the fresh scratches, and that pungent odor in my head. That night, I felt drawn back as though I were a moth circling a distant flame. Despite my own logical arguments, I found myself standing near the shed's entrance once more, flashlight in hand. This time I tried to be more methodical. I approached with caution, noticing how the wind seemed to die the moment I stepped into the shed's shadow. There was a stifling stillness around me. Even the crickets sounded muted, as though they recognized this boundary and dared not invade it. My heart pounded so forcefully that my chest felt tight. I flashed my light around the interior. The layout was exactly as I remembered, but something about the air felt even heavier tonight. The smell of damp earth was accompanied by an undertone that reminded me of decaying leaves or stagnant water, only sharper, almost metallic. I knelt beside one of the fresher-looking scratches on the floor and ran my fingers across the grooves. Small particles of soil clung to my skin, and the indentations felt too clean, too precise. Then a peculiar sensation overcame me, like static electricity prickling along my arms. My flashlight began to flicker, plunging the corners of the shed into an even deeper blackness. Whenever the beam wavered in those intermittent flashes of dark, it felt like the corners expanded, swallowing more space than the walls actually allowed, fighting the urge to panic. I wrapped the flashlight against my palm, praying it wouldn't give out entirely. For a few moments it stabilized, revealing something that turned my blood cold along the far beam. Faint scratch marks much higher off the ground ran parallel to those on the floor. These were vertical, as if something had stood on its hind legs or reached upward, clawing at the wood with intense desperation or fury. The realization that whatever made the floor scratches might also have made these marks. While upright triggered a violent wave of nausea in me, suddenly I felt profoundly vulnerable. My throat tightened and my breath grew ragged anxiously. I swung the flashlight around to check if I was alone. That corner where I'd heard movement the night before remained dark, the air there seeming thicker, more oppressive. Each breath I took felt shallower, my lungs constricting as though rejecting the heavy odor. The boards beneath my feet groaned with every shift of my weight, adding an eerie soundtrack to my growing dread. Compelled by an impulse I couldn't fully explain, I forced myself to inch closer to that malignant corner with every step. A subtle pressure formed at my temples like the onset of a headache. My ears began to ring and my heartbeat thundered, echoing in that ringing until I couldn't distinguish external noise from the pounding in my skull. When I finally angled the flashlight to the darkest spot, my eyes struggled to focus. I saw sacks of something stacked behind an old wooden crate. At first I thought they were simply grain bags that had been left there ages ago. Then I noticed that at least one looked recently used, the burlap not nearly as torn or discolored as I would expect it was, as if someone had been rummaging through supplies in secret, but for what purpose I couldn't guess, hovering there. Gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached, I began to feel a presence close behind me. It was nothing I could see or hear, yet my instincts flared. The temperature felt as though it had plummeted by several degrees, and goosebumps erupted along my arms. The primal urge to turn around to confront whatever might be looming over me wed with the paralyzing terror that insisted I keep my gaze forward. My muscles twitched with tension. Slowly I turned, shining the light in a wide arc across the shed. All I found was stillness. But the sensation of being watched did not subside. In that deafening silence, I became aware of an odd scraping noise. It was faint yet persistent, like claws or nails being dragged along the interior of the shed's outer walls. The direction seemed to change, first one side, then another. It circled me, raising every hair on my neck. My mouth went dry, my tongue turning thick and useless. A queasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. My rational mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Possibly rats or wind-catching stray branches or an echo of the barn's old wooden frame. Contracting, but something about the pattern of those scratchy sounds was too purposeful. Too relentless a memory of overhearing the farmhands suddenly flashed through my mind. They had been talking about hearing inexplicable noises from the shed at night. Their hushed tones and fearful expressions came back to me. One of them mentioned that whenever he approached, everything went silent, as though the place itself was holding its breath. Another claimed to have caught sight of a silhouette moving behind the walls. But when he investigated, he discovered only cobwebs and dusty crates. I had dismissed it as gossip. Now I realized that something inhumanly aware might have taken residence. Within these walls, a wave of panic surged through me, and I knew I had to leave my chest constricted with each breath, the flashlight wobbling in my trembling grip as I backed away. The boards underfoot seemed to protest louder, each creak magnifying my alarm. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt constricted, and beads of cold sweat pulled along my hairline. My flashlight flickered again, plunging me into short staccato bursts of dark. In those momentary blackouts, it felt like the air pressed in closer, as if something intangible was trying to smother me. My pulse soared so high I could practically feel my heartbeat in my eyeballs. When I finally reached the threshold, I half expected something to grab me from behind. The sensation was so strong that I flinched. Involuntarily, I scrambled out into the open air, gulping it in desperately, as though I had just broken the surface after being submerged underwater. My lungs burned, and I stumbled a few paces away before turning to watch the shed from a safer distance. Under the moonlight now peeking through a thin layer of cloud, the structure looked as if it were pulsating, the rotten board shifting in and out of shadow. Then, unmistakably, I heard another thud from within, resonating like a heartbeat. Inside the old timbers, it was almost a response to my escape, a reminder that it was still there. Aware I didn't sleep that night, my mind replayed every second of what I just experienced. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the scratches, felt the suffocating cold at my back, heard the relentless scraping along the walls. It took all my willpower not to sprint to my uncle's room and wake him with my confessions. Instead, I lay in the darkness, heart hammering, staring at the ceiling until pale dawn light crept through the window. The following day, I gathered every ounce of courage and confided in my uncle, once more describing the new things I had seen. He looked at me intently, a grave expression, crossing his weathered features in a voice that remained calm yet carried a hint of concern. He suggested, Ed, I was pushing myself too hard and maybe seeing patterns and shadows still. I detected something unspoken behind his eyes, as if he knew the place. Carried secrets, but preferred to keep them buried, he advised. I stay away from the shed, promising to board it up properly. Soon I took his suggestion to heart. I spent the rest of my stay there, avoiding the shed's vicinity, focusing on the daylight tasks, collecting eggs, helping with the fields, organizing tools, TOS in the main barn. anything to keep my mind occupied. Yet at night I swore I could hear soft scraping drifting across the fields, faint and almost indistinguishable from the rustle of corn leaves. Sometimes I imagined a shape standing by the shed door, tall and contorted in the moonlight, but I never allowed myself to look too closely. Perhaps it was my imagination, or maybe it was real. Either way, I dreaded confirming it when the harvest ended and my time at the farm concluded. I packed my bags with trembling hands. My uncle was grateful for my help, but he couldn't hide the relief in his eyes as I drove away. Even now, whenever I think back on that shed, I recall the suffocating tension in the air, the metallic smell layered over damp earth, and the deep scratches that defied logical explanation. I still feel that spectral gaze following me, a lingering sense that something observed my every move I escaped, without tangible injuries or final answers. But the farm no longer holds the peaceful memories it once did. Instead, it stands as a reminder of how fragile our understanding of reality can be, even in the daylight when all seems safe. There are places better left locked and forgotten, and at night those places breathe with an unseen presence as though they are waiting for the next curious soul to wander inside. I'll never set foot in that shed again. I tell myself that I should be thankful I left with my sanity intact, but I'm not entirely sure I did. Sometimes in the silence of my own home, I hear that faint scraping in the walls. My heartbeat spikes and my skin prickles with the same electric dread I felt that night. Then I remind myself that it's just the house settling or the pipes groaning. But each time, deep down, there's a small part of me that knows better. Some doors once opened are never truly closed for